I am Chloe, 32 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated my existence like a stain on their perfect social record. At my younger sister's lavish engagement party, my mother looked at my navy dress and whispered that I was embarrassing the family. Her future husband, a hedge fund manager, laughed and told me some people simply do not belong in high society. I did not argue. I just took a sip of my sparkling water and smiled. Because 5 minutes later, a spilled glass of wine and an unlocked smartphone revealed that this arrogant groom was hiding a $12 million secret. Before I tell you how I used my position on Wall Street to legally obliterate his career and put him in a federal holding cell, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma is best served ice cold. The engagement party was held at an exclusive golf club in the Hamptons. Crystal glasses clinked over the sounds of a live jazz quartet. My sister Madison was draped in a heavily beaded designer gown, playing the radiant bride-to-be for a crowd of wealthy investors and local socialites. I stood quietly near a towering floral arrangement, holding a glass of mineral water. My mother, Beatrice, marched over to me, her eyes scanning my tailored navy blue silk dress with pure disdain. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and pulled me into a dim alcove. She told me I looked like a broke secretary and that my cheap clothes were humiliating the family in front of Julian's elite colleagues. Julian Thorne approached us, wrapping a possessive arm around Madison. He wore a custom suit and the smug grin of a man who thought he owned the world. He looked me up and down, letting out a dry chuckle. He told me not to worry, noting that maybe if I worked enough overtime at my little desk job, I could afford a real dress one day. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not tell them the dress was a custom Loro Piana piece worth $15,000. I also did not mention the key card hidden in my pocket, which identified me as the Senior Director of Risk and Compliance for Apex Global Investments, the exact firm Julian was desperately trying to impress for a $50 million merger. I just let them enjoy their delusion. As Julian raised his glass to mock me further, a passing waiter bumped his shoulder. Red wine splashed directly onto his crisp white shirt. He cursed, dropping his phone face up on the cocktail table before storming off toward the restroom to clean the stain. Madison chased after him with a napkin. I stood alone next to the table. His phone screen remained unlocked, displaying a live trading dashboard. In my line of work, reading financial data is second nature. It took me exactly 3 seconds to process the numbers glowing on that screen. Julian was not building an empire. He was drowning in a catastrophic margin call. A $12 million deficit glared back at me, hidden behind a newly formed shell company. I memorized the routing numbers instantly. A heavy hand suddenly grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. Julian had returned, his face flushed with panic and anger. He snatched the phone from the table, shoving it deep into his pocket. He leaned down, his breath smelling of expensive scotch, and warned me that if I ever snooped through his belongings again, he would ruin my pathetic career. He sneered and walked away, unaware that he had just handed a federal auditor the exact blueprint to his own destruction. The morning sun cast long, unforgiving shadows across the manicured lawn of my parents' estate. I parked my car in the circular driveway, stepping out into the crisp air. The sprawling colonial mansion was a monument to my father's lifelong obsession with projecting an image of generational wealth. Inside, the air felt heavy, carrying the familiar scent of expensive furniture polish and unspoken demands. I walked through the grand foyer, bypassing the sweeping staircase, and headed straight for the home office. My father, Richard, was seated behind his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer a greeting when I crossed the threshold. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply picked up a crisp piece of paper and slid it across the polished wood surface. The document came to a halt right at the edge of the desk, directly in front of me. I glanced down at the paper. It was a vendor invoice from a premier botanical design firm known for servicing elite corporate galas. The total amount due was $80,000. "Pay it," Richard ordered, his voice carrying the entitled resonance of a man accustomed to blind obedience. Madison wants imported white orchids cascading from the ceiling of the reception hall. The current floral budget is insufficient for the caliber of guests attending. You need to authorize the withdrawal from your grandmother retirement trust fund this morning to cover the difference. I stared at him, letting the sheer absurdity of the demand hang in the quiet room. My grandmother had left that specific trust fund under my sole administration because she knew I was the only person in the family who would not squander the capital on frivolous vanity projects. The account was legally structured to generate long-term yield, not to act as a slush fund for high society parties. I am not draining an $80,000 emergency reserve to buy flowers that will end up in a dumpster by Monday morning, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level. That money is secured in a high-yield account. Breaking the term early incurs penalties I am not willing to absorb. Richard leaned forward, his face flushing a deep shade of red. You lack vision, Chloe. You always have. You sit in your cubicle, counting pennies while Julian is out there building an empire. Julian is closing a $50 million merger next week. Do you understand what that means for this family? We are ascending to the highest echelon of the financial sector. The optics of this wedding must be flawless. You are going to contribute to your sister's future, or you will face severe consequences. Before I could dissect the hollow logic of his argument, the office door swung open. Madison marched into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She wore a silk morning robe and an expression of pure manufactured outrage. Julian followed closely behind her, holding a cup of espresso, looking entirely too pleased with the conflict unfolding. You are just jealous, Madison shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. You have always been jealous of me. You cannot stand the fact that I am marrying a true visionary, while you are stuck living a pathetic, ordinary life. You want my wedding to look cheap because you want me to be as miserable as you are. I looked at my sister, feeling a profound sense of detachment. She was throwing a tantrum over orchids while marrying a man drowning in a $12 million margin call. The irony was almost suffocating. I am protecting an asset, Madison, I replied smoothly. If Julian is closing a $50 million merger, he should have no problem writing a check for your floral arrangements. Why do you need my trust fund to impress his colleagues? Julian stepped forward, wrapping a protective arm around Madison. His jaw tightened, the arrogant smirk slipping just a fraction. My capital is currently tied up in complex offshore investments, Chloe. I am leveraging my liquidity for the upcoming acquisition. I would not expect a mid-level compliance worker to understand high finance. We are asking you to be a team player. The air in the office grew dense with hostility. I was preparing to deliver a final, unyielding refusal when another voice cut through the tension. A sharp investment portfolio does not require begging relatives for flower money. Everyone turned toward the doorway. Marcus, my brother-in-law, leaned casually against the wooden frame. Marcus was a formidable presence. As an African-American man who had spent a decade as a senior investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission, he possessed an uncanny ability to dismantle financial fraud with a single glance. He had recently transitioned into independent wealth management, bringing his federal interrogation skills into the private sector. He was married to my older sister, Maya, and he was the only person in this family who saw right through the polished facade. Marcus walked into the room, his dark eyes scanning the invoice on the desk before shifting his gaze to Julian. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace. He did not need to raise his voice to command the space. What are you doing here? Marcus Richards snapped, clearly unhappy with this sudden interruption. This is a private family discussion regarding wedding logistics. Just dropping off Maya gift for the bride, Marcus replied effortlessly, placing a small wrapped box on the bookshelf. But it sounds like I walked into a bankruptcy hearing instead of a wedding consultation. Madison gasped, clutching her chest in dramatic offense. How dare you? Julian is a titan. He bought me a 4-carat diamond ring. She thrust her left hand forward, the massive stone catching the morning light pouring through the window. Marcus did not blink. He stepped closer to Madison, his eyes dropping to the glittering ring. He studied the jewelry for a brief moment, a calculating glint appearing in his eyes. He recognized the signs of a man desperate to project an illusion of wealth. "It is a beautiful stone," Marcus murmured, his tone smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. But diamonds bought with hot margin money usually have very sharp edges. "Be careful not to cut yourself." The effect of those words was instantaneous. Julian physically recoiled, the color draining entirely from his face. The casual mention of margin money struck a nerve so deep that his confident posture collapsed. His eyes darted frantically toward Marcus, searching for any indication that the former federal investigator knew about his disastrous $12 million deficit. Richard frowned, missing the underlying financial threat entirely. "What kind of nonsense are you talking about?" Richard demanded. "Julian manages a highly successful hedge fund. His margins are flawless." Marcus offered a polite, cryptic smile, keeping his hands resting in his pockets. "Just offering some friendly advice from my days at the commission. The market is highly volatile right now. People who over-leverage themselves tend to sink very fast." Julian could not handle the psychological pressure. His fragile ego, punctured by the accurate assessment of his hidden financial ruin, reacted with explosive anger. He slammed his coffee cup down on the mahogany desk, spilling hot espresso across the polished wood. "Shut your mouth," Julian roared, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus and then directing his fury squarely at me. "This is your fault. You bring this toxic energy into our lives because you are a bitter, lonely woman. You think you can sit there and judge my finances? You think you can withhold a pathetic trust fund and disrespect my future wife?" I stood my ground, watching him spiral. I did not flinch as he invaded my personal space, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "You listen to me very carefully," Chloe Julian hissed, lowering his voice to a menacing register. "I operate in circles you can only dream of. I have friends on the executive boards of every major financial firm in this city. If you do not authorize that withdrawal today and show this family the respect we deserve, I will make a single phone call. I will have your little desk job terminated by tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from the entire financial sector." He leaned closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Do not test my power. I can crush your entire career before you even finish your morning coffee." I looked into the panicked, bloodshot eyes of a man who was actively drowning in his own deceit. He thought he was issuing a lethal threat. He had no idea he was threatening the senior director of risk and compliance at the exact conglomerate he needed to save his life. "I will keep that in mind." "Julian," I replied, my voice a quiet, chilling promise. The heavy oak door of my parents' estate slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my sister throwing her engineered tantrum. I walked briskly down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my heels. Marcus fell into step beside me, his long strides easily matching my pace. We did not exchange a single word until we were secured inside his vehicle. As he started the engine, the veneer of the polite brother-in-law faded entirely. The seasoned federal investigator took the wheel. Marcus had spent 8 years hunting insider trading rings for the government before pivoting to private wealth management. He knew the distinct scent of corporate decay. He navigated the winding suburban roads with practiced efficiency, steering us away from the suffocating neighborhood of pristine lawns and hollow reputations. We headed straight for his downtown residence. His apartment was a fortress of digital security, providing a stark contrast to the pretentious colonial mansion we had just escaped. It featured soundproof walls, biometric locks, and a dedicated server room that rivaled most mid-tier financial institutions. Once inside, we bypassed the living area and went directly to his home office. Marcus booted up his custom rig, causing dual monitors to cast a cool blue glow across the dark room. He logged into a secure virtual private network, accessing a shadow database he maintained from his days at the commission. He turned his desk chair toward me, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. He instructed me to recite the numbers, his hands hovering over the mechanical keyboard. I closed my eyes, accessing the mental snapshot I had taken during the engagement party. When Julian carelessly left his phone unlocked to clean his ruined shirt, my brain had automatically archived the data glowing on his screen. I recited the 9-digit routing sequence and the corresponding offshore account identifiers flawlessly. Marcus typed the sequence, his fingers flying across the keys. The software initiated a deep dive, tearing through layers of corporate anonymity. Amateurs often believe that establishing a limited liability company in a tax haven provides an impenetrable shield. But financial crimes always leave a digital exhaust trail. Marcus ran a cross-reference protocol, hunting for the ultimate beneficiary attached to those specific digits. For 10 tense minutes, the only sound in the office was the hum of the computer processors. I poured 2 cups of black coffee, knowing we were about to uncover something foul. The screen flickered, populating a complex web of transactions. Marcus leaned closer to the monitor, tracing a line from a shell entity back to Julian Primary Hedge Fund. A low whistle escaped his lips. He noted that my future brother-in-law was not building an empire. His tone laced with clinical disgust. He stated Julian was standing at the edge of a cliff. The ledger displayed a staggering deficit. Julian had engaged in highly leveraged derivative trading, betting millions of dollars on volatile market shifts that had ultimately tanked. The resulting margin call was sitting right there in glaring red ink. He was $12 million in the hole. The brokers were demanding immediate liquidity to cover the failed positions. The pieces of the puzzle rapidly snapped together in my mind. The $80,000 invoice for imported orchids was never about floral arrangements. It was a calculated stress test. Julian needed to determine exactly how pliable my parents were and how quickly they would force a family member to liquidate assets to appease him. If my father was willing to drain my grandmother retirement trust just to secure fancy centerpieces for a party, it proved they possessed zero financial boundaries. They were the perfect marks. I reasoned out loud, studying the cascading red numbers on the screen. I explained that $80,000 is pocket change compared to his debt, and he is hunting for something much bigger. Marcus typed another command, pulling up the public property records tied to my father's import-export business. The screen flooded with commercial deeds. Marcus deduced that Julian is targeting the real estate, tapping the glass of the monitor. He explained Julian intends to use my parents' commercial warehouses as cross-collateral. If he can convince Richard to sign a blind guarantor agreement under the guise of family investment, Julian can leverage those physical properties to secure a high-risk bridge loan. He will use that loan to quietly pay off his margin call before anyone notices the missing capital. He is planning to steal their entire life savings to save his own skin. I pointed out that he is running out of time analyzing the date stamps on the broker warnings. A deficit this large triggers mandatory federal reporting thresholds within weeks. He needs a corporate rescue to bury the debt permanently. He mentioned a merger this morning, claiming he was closing a $50 million acquisition that would elevate his fund. Marcus pulled up the impending filings from the Securities and Exchange Commission database. The search results returned a pending letter of intent. Julian Firm was indeed seeking to be absorbed by a larger corporate entity. The acquiring syndicate would absorb his liabilities, wiping the slate clean through creative restructuring. I looked at the name of the acquiring conglomerate listed on the federal filing. The name glaring back at me was Apex Global Investments. A profound, chilling silence enveloped the room. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at me, a predatory smirk touching the corners of his mouth. Out of all the investment banks on Wall Street, Julian had targeted Apex Global. The irony was so rich it bordered on cinematic. My family had spent my entire adult life mocking my career. They called me a glorified desk clerk. They ridiculed my decision to drop my father's prestigious surname and use my mother's maiden name in my professional life to avoid their toxic shadow. Because of that deliberate separation, Julian had no idea who he was actually dealing with. He assumed Chloe, the stubborn sister holding on to a meager trust fund, was a helpless nobody. He did not know that Chloe was the senior director of risk and compliance for Apex Global Investments. Every single acquisition, every merger, Every corporate buyout that crossed the desk of our chief executive officer required my direct authorization. I was the supreme gatekeeper. I held the ultimate veto power over the exact transaction Julian desperately needed to avoid a federal prison cell. He had stood in my father's home less than 2 hours ago and threatened to use his connections to get me fired. The sheer delusion required to threaten the executioner while laying your head on the chopping block was breathtaking. I leaned back in my chair, stating softly that he thinks he holds all the cards. He believes my parents will hand over their commercial deeds by the end of the week. Marcus closed the secure terminal, leaving only the glowing evidence of the margin call on the screen. He advised that we need to secure the proof before Julian scrubs his digital footprint. If he suspects we know about the deficit, he will try to accelerate the real estate transfer. Just as I reached for my coffee, my personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. The caller identification showed an unknown number, but the ensuing text message bypassed any pleasantries. The message demanded a private meeting at a secluded coffee shop on the edge of the financial district in exactly 1 hour. The sender promised a highly lucrative arrangement if I agreed to stop interfering with his wedding plans. Julian was panicking. He realized his intimidation tactics at the house had failed, and now he was pivoting to outright bribery. He was inviting me into the lion den, offering dirty money to secure my silence. I stood up, grabbing my coat. The game of chess had officially begun, and it was time to let him think he was winning the board. The text message dictated a specific location. It was a rundown coffee shop nestled in a forgotten industrial corridor far from the polished glass towers of the financial district. It was exactly the kind of isolated venue a man chooses when he wants to conduct illicit business without leaving a trace. I parked my car a block away, pulling up the collar of my wool coat against the biting wind. Before stepping out, I tapped an application on my smartwatch, initiating a secure audio recording protocol that synced directly to Marcus' secure servers. I walked through the dingy glass door. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and cheap disinfectant. Julian was sitting in a dark corner booth far from the front windows. The transformation in his appearance was striking. Gone was the immaculate aristocratic posture he had displayed at the engagement party. He wore a dark trench coat buttoned tightly, and his usually flawless hair looked unkempt. As I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, the overhead fluorescent light illuminated his face. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, ringed with dark circles that betrayed days of extreme sleep deprivation. He was a man running on raw adrenaline and mounting terror. He did not bother with pleasantries. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the sticky Formica table. The heavy package landed with a dull thud, right in front of me. There is $50,000 in untraceable cash right there. Julian stated his voice a harsh, raspy whisper. Take it. Consider it an early wedding gift. All you have to do is sign a standard legal waiver renouncing any future claim to your parents' commercial real estate holdings. You walk away, you keep your mouth shut, and you let Madison and me handle the family legacy. I looked at the envelope, feeling a deep, clinical satisfaction. He was confirming every single piece of data Marcus had unearthed. Julian desperately needed my parents' commercial properties free of any encumbrances or potential sibling disputes. He intended to pledge those warehouses as collateral to secure a bridge loan and cover his massive trading deficit. I did not touch the money. I folded my hands, resting them carefully on the table. You are offering me pocket change to forfeit my legal rights to properties worth millions. I replied, maintaining a calm, even tone. If your hedge fund is doing as brilliantly as you claim, $50,000 seems like a rather insulting bribe. Why the sudden urgency, Julian? Are you struggling to find liquidity? His jaw clenched, the muscles ticking rapidly beneath his skin. The subtle mention of liquidity struck a raw nerve. He leaned across the table, invading my personal space, trying to use physical intimidation to mask his glaring vulnerability. Do not play games with me. Chloe, he sneered, gripping the edge of the table. You sit in a cubicle all day, auditing compliance reports. You have no idea how corporate empires operate. I am offering you a generous payout to mind your own business. If you refuse, I will make sure your parents disinherit you completely. I will ensure you never see a dime of their wealth, and I will use my industry connections to destroy your pathetic career." I allowed a flicker of manufactured hesitation to cross my face. I needed him to believe his threats were landing. I looked down at the table, breaking eye contact, projecting the image of a cautious woman weighing her limited options. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to endure the agonizing pressure of his own ticking clock. $50,000 does not even cover the taxes on those properties, I murmured, acting as though I was mentally calculating a counteroffer. If you want me to permanently sign away my inheritance and walk away from my family, you need to compensate me for the actual value of my silence. Julian let out a sharp, frustrated exhale. He recognized the shift in my demeanor, interpreting my hesitation as simple greed. In his arrogant mind, everyone had a price, and he was thrilled to discover mine. He leaned back in the vinyl booth, a sickeningly smug grin returning to his face. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You want to play in the big leagues? I will authorize a $2 million transfer into your account. We will classify it as a virtual consulting fee for my investment firm. The money will be wired by the end of the business day. You sign the property waivers tonight." He watched me closely, expecting me to gasp at the figure. He thought he was buying my dignity. He failed to realize he was merely funding his own federal indictment. $2 million, I repeated, keeping my expression neutral. That is a significant consulting fee. I assume you want me to provide a domestic routing number for the transfer. Julian waved his hand dismissively, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. Domestic offshore, it does not matter to me. Just give me the account details. I will initiate the transaction right now to prove I am a man of my word. Every person has a price. Chloe. I am just glad yours is finally out in the open. I reached into my purse and retrieved a small notepad. I uncapped my pen and wrote down a highly specific 9-digit routing sequence, followed by a corresponding account number. I slid the paper across the table. Julian snatched the paper, typing the digits into a secure banking application on his phone. He executed the transfer with a few rapid taps, feeling entirely victorious. He believed he had just successfully bribed an obstacle out of his path. He had no idea that the account details I provided did not belong to my personal bank. The sequence was a specialized honeypot. Before leaving the apartment, Marcus had accessed a restricted federal registry to generate that specific account. It was a digital trap directly linked to the automated monitoring network of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The moment Julian hit send, he transmitted illicit funds under the guise of a fraudulent consulting fee, triggering an immediate federal alert. His attempt at bribery and corporate money laundering was now permanently logged on a government server. "The transaction is pending," Julian announced, locking his phone and standing up from the booth. "The funds will clear by sunset. Have the signed property waivers ready when I come to the house tonight. Try anything stupid, and I will ruin you." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving the envelope of cash sitting on the table. I remained in the booth, watching him climb into a waiting luxury sedan through the rain-streaked window. He drove away convinced he was a master strategist manipulating a naive sister-in-law. I picked up the envelope and slipped it into my bag. It would serve as excellent physical evidence. I tapped my smartwatch, ending the audio recording and forwarding the encrypted file straight to Marcus. The trap had functioned flawlessly. Julian had willingly provided the federal authorities with a verified digital fingerprint connecting his personal device to an illegal wire transfer. I stood up, exiting the cafe, and walking back toward my vehicle. The cold city air felt invigorating. I had secured the bribery conviction, but a much larger battlefield awaited me. Julian was still desperate to finalize the $50 million merger with Apex Global Investments. He still needed that corporate rescue to bury his $12 million margin call. As I unlocked my car door, my secure corporate phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller identification displayed the direct line for the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global. I answered the call immediately, transitioning back into the role of Senior Director of Risk and Compliance. Chloe, my boss, stated his voice, echoing with urgent professionalism. Julian Thorne just officially submitted the final merger documentation through our secure portal. We are reviewing the legal disclosures right now. Did he include the collateral guarantees I asked starting the engine? He did, the CEO confirmed, causing a chilling tension to settle over the line. But there is a massive anomaly in the risk assessment profile. He did not just pledge his own firm assets. He explicitly listed your parents' import-export business and their commercial real estate holdings as the primary financial guarantors for his existing corporate debt. He forged a cross-collateralization agreement. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Julian was not waiting for the property waivers. He was moving ahead, blindly, illegally binding my parents' entire livelihood to his sinking ship. If Apex Global absorbed his firm, those fraudulent guarantees would become active. My parents would lose everything they owned the moment his creditors called in his debts. Do not reject the merger application. I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation. Let him believe the paperwork is moving through standard compliance channels. Schedule the final board approval meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Invite him to the corporate headquarters. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The CEO recognized the tactical maneuver. You want to execute the denial in person. I want him to walk into the boardroom expecting a coronation, I replied, shifting the car into gear. I want him to stand in front of the entire executive committee and present his fraudulent financials. When he is standing at the very peak of his arrogance, we will drop the floor right out from under him. Consider the meeting scheduled. The CEO agreed. We will prepare the boardroom on the top floor. I disconnected the call, merging into the dense city traffic. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes game of deception. He thought he could manipulate my family, steal their assets, and bribe his way out of a financial crater. He believed his tailored suits and aggressive posturing made him untouchable. He was about to discover that the quiet woman he had spent years insulting was the apex predator waiting patiently at the top of the food chain. Tomorrow, he would walk into a glass-walled boardroom, expecting to secure his $50 million salvation. Instead, he would find himself staring directly into the eyes of the executioner. The real war was about to begin. The digital clock on my secondary monitor shifted to 2 a.m. My office at Apex Global Investments was cloaked in shadows save for the sterile blue glow of 3 large screens. I was reviewing the final legal frameworks for the upcoming board meeting when a silent crimson alert flashed across the corner of my primary display. It was an automated notification from our cybersecurity division signaling an external breach attempt. Someone was actively trying to hack into the primary server architecture of our conglomerate. I did not panic. I picked up my secure phone and dialed the head of our IT department. Julian was a man backed into a corner, and cornered animals always make fatal mistakes. His impending merger depended on a flawless financial audit. Knowing his derivatives debt was an unpayable mountain, he had decided to circumvent the law entirely. He had hired a black hat operative on the dark web to wipe his institutional liabilities from our system before the morning boardroom review. My IT director answered the phone, his voice tight with urgency, requesting permission to deploy the countermeasures and block the incoming attack. I instructed him to stand down. Blocking the attack would only force the hacker to retreat and cover their tracks, leaving us without tangible proof of Julian crossing another federal boundary. I ordered the security team to open a deliberate backdoor in our outer firewall. We were going to invite the intruder inside. In the realm of cyber defense, we use a tactic called a sandbox. It is a highly sophisticated decoy server isolated from the actual corporate network. It mirrors the real environment perfectly, but contains nothing but fabricated ledgers, dummy accounts, and useless code. I watched my screen as our tech team quickly routed the hostile connection straight into the phantom maze. The intruder moved with the clumsy speed of someone operating on a strict deadline. Julian had likely promised a lucrative bonus for a swift resolution. I traced the digital footprint as the hacker bypassed our intentionally weakened security gates, navigating through fake directories searching for Julian-specific debt portfolios. This person thought they were outsmarting the elite digital defenses of a major Wall Street player. They had zero idea they were crawling through a simulated cage designed specifically for them. After 10 minutes of navigating the dummy servers, the hacker located their target. It was a file I had personally titled Consolidated Risk Report and Liabilities. The file appeared to contain every shred of evidence regarding Julian's $12 million margin call. The hacker initiated the download sequence. I sat back in my leather chair, sipping my cold coffee, watching the progress bar creep across my monitor. The file was heavy padding the download time to sell the illusion of complex financial data. The intruder extracted the payload, closing their connection, and vanished back into the encrypted layers of the dark web. They believed they had just executed a flawless corporate heist, wiping Julian's slate clean. What they actually downloaded was a military-grade Trojan virus carefully embedded deep within the metadata of the fake risk report. It was a dormant digital weapon waiting for a human trigger. Across the city, in a hyper-exclusive nightclub, Julian was basking in his manufactured victory. Marcus had tapped into a network of private investigators who kept tabs on Julian's physical movements. The reports coming in painted a picture of staggering delusion. Julian was sitting in a velvet VIP booth surrounded by sycophants and expensive bottles of champagne. He had just received the encrypted confirmation message from his hired operative claiming the Apex Global servers were wiped clean. His debt was allegedly erased. He ordered another round of drinks, raising his glass to toast his own sheer brilliance. He laughed loudly, celebrating his transition from a desperate debtor to the conquering king of the financial district. He thought he had outmaneuvered a billion-dollar conglomerate and permanently silenced his stubborn sister-in-law. He danced under the flashing strobe lights, spending money he no longer possessed, convinced that tomorrow would bring him ultimate power. While Julian drank expensive liquor, his hired operative made a catastrophic error. The hacker opened the downloaded risk report to verify the contents before demanding their final payment. The exact moment the file executed on their local machine, my Trojan awoke. It did not freeze their computer or demand a ransom. It operated with silent surgical precision, bypassing their local firewalls from the inside out. Within seconds, the virus seized administrative control of the hacker operating system. My monitor at Apex Global lit up with a stream of incoming decrypted data. The Trojan began cloning the hacker's entire hard drive, transmitting the mirrored files directly to my secure terminal. I watched the raw data pour in, dissecting the files with methodical efficiency. The hacker had utilized layers of virtual private networks to hide their physical location, but the virus bypassed all external masking by reading their root directory. I extracted their real identity, their physical address, and their linked bank accounts. But the most valuable prize was sitting in a hidden chat log. I opened the encrypted correspondence between the operative and their client. It was a pristine, unalterable record of Julian ordering a cyber attack against a major financial institution. The chat logs detailed his explicit instructions to destroy corporate records. Attached to the end of the conversation was the digital receipt for the service rendered. Julian had paid the hacker $100,000 using an untraceable Bitcoin wallet to execute the breach. Julian had effectively documented his own intent to commit federal corporate espionage and cyber terrorism. He handed me the exact weapon required to dismantle his life without leaving a single fingerprint of my own. I compiled the cloned hard drive data, the Bitcoin transaction hashes, and the unedited chat logs into a single encrypted dossier. I did not send this information to the local police. Local authorities lacked the jurisdiction and the technical expertise to handle a crime of this magnitude. I routed the evidence packet through a secure federal portal, transmitting it directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The automated confirmation receipt appeared on my screen, verifying that federal agents now possessed undeniable proof of Julian orchestrating a cyber attack against a protected financial entity. The trap was locked. Julian had spent his evening drinking away his fears, believing he had purchased a clean slate. He had no idea his digital assassin had just delivered his murder weapon straight to the federal government. The sun began to rise over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my glass desk. I closed my laptop, feeling a deep, resonant sense of triumph. The board meeting was scheduled for the afternoon. Julian would walk into that room, believing his financial sins were buried. He would project the image of a flawless executive, ready to merge his firm with an industry titan. He failed to realize that every step he took forward was a step deeper into a concrete cell. My phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the polished wood. It was a text from Marcus, who was monitoring the family group chats. Julian had just woken up from his night of celebration. Fueled by his arrogant assumption of total victory, he did not spend his morning preparing for the merger presentation. Instead, he picked up his phone and called my father, Richard. Julian demanded that the wedding guest list be doubled immediately. He arrogantly instructed my parents to invite every elite investor in their social circle, claiming he wanted a grand audience to witness his impending corporate coronation. He wanted the world to watch him ascend the throne. He was eagerly building the grandest stage possible, entirely unaware that he was simply selling tickets to his own public execution. The morning sunlight sliced through the tall windows of my penthouse, offering a deceptive sense of tranquility. The adrenaline from securing the federal evidence against Julian's cyber attack had barely settled into my bloodstream when my personal cell phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my mother, Beatrice. She never initiated contact before noon unless she required an audience for a social emergency or needed to issue a specific demand. I answered the line, maintaining my measured breathing. Her voice pierced the speaker, frantic, shrill, and lacking its usual aristocratic polish. She demanded I come to the family estate immediately, claiming Madison was experiencing a sudden, catastrophic medical emergency. I ended the call, grabbed my car keys, and drove across the city, my mind automatically analyzing the sudden shift in the timeline. Julian was scheduled to present his merger documentation to my board today. A life-threatening medical crisis just hours before a rigorous corporate review felt highly convenient. I parked in the circular driveway of the sprawling colonial estate. I walked through the heavy front doors without bothering to knock. The grand living room resembled a poorly staged theatrical tragedy. Madison lay draped across the expensive velvet sofa, clutching her stomach and sobbing with loud, performative gasps. Her makeup was artfully smudged, designed to convey deep distress without ruining her carefully curated aesthetic. Beatrice hovered nearby, wringing her hands in a display of maternal panic, while my father, Richard, paced the length of the imported Persian rug. Standing right beside the sofa, playing the role of the devastated but resolute protector, was Julian. He wore a crisp, white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, projecting the image of a man ready to move mountains to save his family. Julian looked up as I entered the room. He did not offer a greeting or acknowledge my presence as a sister. Instead, he turned his focus entirely back to my father. He held a thick stack of legal documents, presenting them to Richard with grave urgency. Julian claimed Madison was suffering from a highly specific and rare pregnancy complication that local specialists were unequipped to handle. He spun a terrifying narrative about fetal distress and imminent danger, utilizing complex-sounding medical jargon to overwhelm my parents. He insisted the only viable option for survival was an experimental surgical procedure at an elite private clinic in Switzerland. He declared they needed to charter a specialized medical evacuation flight and secure the overseas surgical team within the hour before time ran out. The catch, Julian explained, lowering his voice to a sorrowful, breaking whisper, was the required upfront capital. He claimed his own hedge fund assets were temporarily locked due to the strict compliance periods surrounding his impending corporate merger. He stated he needed $5 million in liquid cash right now to save his unborn child. He pushed a sleek metal pen toward my father. The document resting on the glass coffee table was a liquid asset transfer agreement. It granted Julian immediate and unrestricted power of attorney over my parents' primary investment portfolios. Richard looked terrified. For all his faults and his relentless obsession with high society status, my father genuinely cared about his lineage. The thought of losing his first grandchild blinded his usual sharp business acumen. He reached for the pen, his hand shaking visibly. I stepped closer to the coffee table, maintaining a calm, detached demeanor. I glanced down at the medical paperwork Julian had provided as proof of the diagnosis. The document bore the prestigious letterhead of a highly exclusive private maternity hospital located in the city center. To my panicked parents, it looked like a terrifying death sentence. To a corporate risk and compliance director, it looked like a clumsy, desperate forgery. My eyes scanned the printed text, dissecting the inconsistencies. The typography was uneven, lacking the standard digital watermarks used by premium healthcare networks. The diagnostic codes listed near the bottom did not match current medical billing standards. Furthermore, the attending physician's signature block lacked the mandatory National Provider Identifier number required on all official diagnostic reports. Julian had forged a medical crisis to extort $5 million directly from my family hours before his own margin call caused his financial ruin. He was trying to drain their retirement accounts to save himself, pretending it was a heroic rescue mission for his wife. I did not start a screaming match. I pulled out my phone and stepped back into the quiet foyer, leaving them to their theatrical weeping. I dialed the direct administrative line for the private maternity hospital listed on the forged letterhead. The chief of obstetrics at that specific facility was a woman I had shared a dorm with during my time at an Ivy League university. We had maintained a close professional network over the years, sharing insights on medical tech investments. She answered on the third ring. I kept my voice low, providing Madison full legal name and date of birth. I requested a simple verification of her admission status, citing a family emergency. My friend accessed the hospital's secure registry. She confirmed my exact suspicions without hesitation. Madison was not currently an admitted patient. In fact, the hospital records showed Madison had not stepped foot inside their facility for any kind of consultation in over 14 months. The entire pregnancy complication was a fabricated extortion plot designed to steal millions. I ended the call and walked back into the living room, just as Richard pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line of the transfer agreement. I reached out and pulled the document smoothly out from under his hand. Richard looked up, startled and furious. Beatrice shrieked, asking what I was doing and accusing me of trying to harm my own sister out of petty jealousy. I ignored my mother and looked directly at Julian. I told my father to put the pen down. I explained that there was no medical emergency and no experimental surgery waiting in Switzerland. I pointed out the missing provider numbers on the diagnostic paperwork and the outdated billing codes that no legitimate doctor would ever use. I watched Julian face shift from manufactured sorrow to cold, hard panic. I announced to the room that I had just spoken with the chief of obstetrics at the private hospital. Madison was not a patient there and had not been seen by their medical staff in over a year. Madison stopped crying instantly. She sat up on the sofa, her face pale, looking frantically at Julian for a lifeline. Her performative pain vanished, replaced by the stark terror of a fraudster caught in the act. Richard stared at that forged medical document and then looked at his future son-in-law, deep confusion clouding his features. Julian realized his final escape route had just been severed. The $5 million he desperately needed to cover his derivatives debt was slipping through his fingers. The calm, sophisticated hedge fund manager persona melted away, revealing the desperate, cornered predator underneath. His eyes turned dark and lethal. He lunged across the glass coffee table, ignoring my parents entirely. He closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. His hands shot out, gripping my throat with bruising force. The sudden impact drove me backward until my spine hit the heavy wooden bookshelf. The air was forcefully driven from my lungs. Julian leaned his face mere inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged against my skin. He snarled that I had ruined everything and promised to crush the life out of me before I could destroy his merger. Beatrice screamed, dropping her porcelain coffee cup onto the rug. Richard stood frozen, unable to process the sudden assault erupting in his pristine living room. My vision began to blur at the edges, but I did not surrender to the fear. I knew I was not alone. The front door of the estate had opened quietly moments before Julian launched his attack. Marcus had followed me to the house, anticipating that Julian's erratic behavior would escalate once his financial walls started closing in. Before Julian could tighten his grip, a large, powerful hand clamped onto his shoulder. Marcus moved with the swift, terrifying precision of a former federal investigator. He did not waste time yelling or issuing warnings to de-escalate the situation. He applied immediate calculated leverage to Julian's arm, twisting it sharply backward. Julian let out a loud, agonizing yelp, releasing his grip on my throat as pain flooded his nervous system. Marcus swept Julian's legs out from under him, sending the arrogant executive crashing hard onto the hardwood floor. Marcus dropped his knee firmly between Julian's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground while twisting his arm into a professional submission lock. Julian thrashed against the floor, cursing and demanding to be released, but he could not break the hold. I rubbed my neck, catching my breath while looking down at the man who had just tried to silence me. He was pinned to the floor of my parents' living room, a pathetic, exposed fraud stripped of his elite armor. Yet the true horror of the morning was not Julian's physical outburst. The true horror was the reaction of my own family. Instead of checking if I was injured, Beatrice knelt beside Julian, demanding that Marcus let him go. She turned her furious gaze toward me, blaming me for provoking him. The psychological rot ran deeper than I could have ever anticipated, leading us straight toward a very dark, unyielding path where blood meant nothing and status meant everything. The heavy oak door of my parents' estate slammed shut, cutting off the crisp morning air. Marcus kept his knee pressed firmly against Julian's spine. The room hung in a state of suspended animation. I expected my father to call the police. I expected Richard to demand an explanation for the forged medical documents scattered across the floor and the unprovoked assault that had just occurred in his pristine living room. Instead, Richard adjusted his suit jacket, walked over to the coffee table, and looked directly at my brother-in-law. "Let him go," Marcus Richard commanded. His voice held no trace of shock. It was flat clinical and carrying the distinct tone of a chief executive officer managing a minor logistical inconvenience. Marcus tightened his grip, glancing up at me with deep concern. I touched my bruised neck, shaking my head slightly. I needed to see the bottom of this abyss. Marcus slowly released the pressure, standing up, while keeping a watchful eye on the man scrambling to his feet. Julian dusted off his trousers, shooting a venomous glare in our direction. "Get out of my house," Richard ordered, pointing toward the grand foyer. "Both of you leave right now." I told Marcus to wait outside. I needed 5 minutes. Marcus hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his professional discipline, but he stepped through the entryway. The heavy doors clicked shut. Then the deadbolt turned with a sharp, metallic snap. Richard locked the door, trapping me inside the living room with my sister, my mother, and the man who had just tried to choke the life out of me. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The panicked weeping ceased. Madison wiped the smeared makeup from her eyes, walking over to the wet bar to pour herself a glass of sparkling water. She did not look like a woman whose fake pregnancy had just been exposed. She looked bored. Beatrice settled back onto the velvet sofa, crossing her legs with aristocratic grace. I stood near the bookshelf, my mind struggling to process the bizarre transition. "You saw the forged hospital records," I stated, presenting the facts clearly to pierce their delusion. Julian faked a medical crisis to steal $5 million. He is drowning in margin calls. He is facing financial ruin. Richard walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured 2 fingers of scotch. "We are well aware of the margin call," Chloe, my father, replied, handing the glass to Julian. He took a slow sip, savoring the expensive liquor. $12 million is a substantial hole. But in the world of high finance, we view deficits as opportunities for leverage. The word struck me like a physical blow. The oxygen left my lungs. They knew. My parents, the people who raised me, were not ignorant victims falling for a charismatic fraudster. They were willing participants. Julian smirked, leaning against the marble mantelpiece. He took a sip of the scotch, looking at me with pure disdain. "You really thought you were the only one who could read a balance sheet," he sneered. Richard and I established a mutually beneficial arrangement weeks ago. We do not need your protection. My father set his glass down, resting his hands on the back of a leather armchair. The import-export business has been bleeding cash for 3 consecutive quarters. Richard explained, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. Tariffs and supply chain disruptions crippled our profit margins. We needed an immediate injection of capital to prevent our creditors from forcing a liquidation. Julian needed a clean, untraceable avenue to wash his remaining assets and cover his trading losses before the Apex Global audit. The puzzle pieces locked together, forming a picture of breathtaking depravity. "You turned the family corporation into a shell node," I whispered the reality, chilling my blood. "You let him route illicit funds through your operating accounts to scrub the digital trail." "It is called synergy," Richard corrected smoothly. "Julian filters his capital through our international shipping ledgers. We register the incoming cash as foreign investments, protecting our domestic credit rating. In exchange for utilizing our infrastructure, I receive a 10% equity stake in his post-merger entity. $50 million is on the table. Chloe, $5 million of that belongs to this family the moment the ink dries on his Apex contract." I looked at Madison. She was sipping her water, scrolling through her social media feeds. "And the fake pregnancy?" I asked, feeling a deep wave of nausea. Madison rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "External accountants review dad company ledgers every quarter," she said, without looking up from her screen. "We needed a bulletproof excuse to justify a sudden $5 million outbound wire transfer to a Swiss account. A life-threatening medical emergency abroad, bypassing standard insurance protocols, was the perfect cover story. Nobody questions a desperate grandfather trying to save his unborn grandchild. It was a flawless narrative until you ruin the performance. They were monsters. They had weaponized the sacred concept of a child life, turning it into a cheap, theatrical prop to facilitate federal money laundering. They sold their souls for a 10% stake in a fraudulent enterprise." I straightened my posture, ignoring the throbbing pain in my neck. "You are conspiring to commit international wire fraud and tax evasion," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable truth. "The Securities and Exchange Commission will dismantle this entire estate. You will all spend decades in a federal penitentiary." The room went dead silent. The aristocratic mask slipped away, revealing the ruthless predators beneath. Beatrice stood up from the sofa. She walked toward me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped mere inches from my face. Her eyes were devoid of maternal warmth, replaced by a dark, venomous calculation. "You always believed your little compliance job made you superior," Beatrice hissed. "You always looked down on this family because we understood how the real world operates." Before I could brace myself, she raised her hand and struck me across the face. The slap was brutal, carrying the full weight of her resentment. The sharp sting radiated across my cheekbone, turning my skin a fierce red. My head snapped to the side. I tasted copper as my teeth cut into the inside of my lip. I slowly turned my head back to face her, keeping my expression entirely blank. I did not raise a hand to my cheek. I did not shed a single tear. "Listen to me, you ungrateful child," Beatrice commanded, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "We built a life of privilege for you. We expect loyalty. You are going to sign the cross-collateralization agreement right now. You are going to co-sign the bridge loan, using your pristine credit score, to ensure Julian secures the remaining capital required to finalize his merger." I stared at her, letting the silence speak for my defiance. "I will not sign anything," I replied, keeping my tone flat. Beatrice smiled a terrifying, hollow expression. "If you refuse, we will destroy you," she promised, her voice a soft, lethal whisper. "You work in risk compliance. Your career depends on maintaining a flawless psychological and ethical profile. We already have the forged medical letterhead Julian created for Madison. It takes very little effort to generate a secondary diagnostic report bearing your name." My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs. She was outlining a campaign of psychological warfare designed to eradicate my existence. "We will leak medical documents to your board of directors," Beatrice continued, her eyes gleaming with toxic triumph. "We will claim you suffered a severe psychotic break. We will state you have been battling paranoid schizophrenia and experiencing vivid delusions about corporate espionage within your own family. We will file a petition for temporary conservatorship, citing your erratic behavior today as proof of your mental decline." Richard nodded in agreement, stepping up beside his wife, forming an impenetrable wall of hostility. No financial institution will retain a compliance director facing an involuntary psychiatric hold. Your federal clearances will be revoked. You will be blacklisted from Wall Street. You will lose your income, your reputation, and your independence. We will strip you down to nothing and leave you locked in a state-funded ward. Julian walked over, picking up the liquid asset transfer and the loan guarantor documents from the coffee table. He uncapped his silver fountain pen. He slid the paperwork across the glass surface, pushing it right to the edge. "You are outmatched." Chloe Julian sneered, his confidence fully restored by my parents' intervention. "You can either sign the papers and join the winning team, or you can walk out that door as an unemployed psychiatric patient. The choice is yours. Make it quick. My brokers are waiting for the confirmation." I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the people who shared my bloodline. They had just promised to erase my sanity and my livelihood to protect a criminal enterprise. They thought they had trapped a helpless animal in a corner. They expected me to break under the immense pressure of their blackmail. They did not realize they had just handed me the exact tools I needed to engineer their total destruction. I looked down at the pen, gleaming under the chandelier light. My mind bypassed the fear and locked onto a singular federal loophole waiting to be exploited. I stood in the center of my childhood living room, surrounded by the people who shared my DNA. They watched me like scavengers circling a wounded animal. My mother, Beatrice, stood near the limestone fireplace, adjusting her posture to project undeniable authority. My father, Richard, hovered near the mahogany desk, his gaze fixed on the silver fountain pen resting on the glass coffee table. Julian leaned against the leather armchair, crossing his arms and waiting for my inevitable surrender. Madison remained sprawled on the velvet sofa, entirely unbothered by the extortion taking place a few feet away. I did not scream. I did not plead for mercy or attempt to reason with a room full of sociopaths. As a compliance director overseeing billions in corporate assets, I spent my days analyzing the behavioral patterns of desperate executives. Pleading only validates their perceived power. Showing fear feeds their delusion of control. Instead, I stepped forward. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing in the suffocating silence of the estate. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen. The cool metal felt grounding against my palm. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Julian's face. He uncrossed his arms, stepping closer to supervise the transaction. He told me it was the smartest decision I could possibly make. His voice dripped with arrogant condescension as he whispered that everyone possesses a breaking point. He boasted that he was glad I finally recognized my place in the hierarchy. He leaned over the table, murmuring that blood might be thick, but money dictates gravity. He truly believed he had orchestrated a flawless checkmate. I pulled the thick stack of legal documents toward me. The paperwork detailed a massive bridge loan, leveraging my pristine credit score and my parents' commercial real estate to secure millions in liquid capital. I positioned the tip of the pen over the primary guarantor line. Years ago, during a specialized federal fraud prevention seminar hosted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, my team received training on extraction protocols. We learned how hostage victims in corporate kidnappings could secretly signal law enforcement while finalizing forced ransom transfers. The technique is known as a duress signature. It is a deliberate, calculated deviation from a standard legally binding autograph. I pressed the ink into the heavy paper. I intentionally altered the initial slant of the capital letter in my first name, shifting it from a sharp forward lean to an unnatural backward angle. I continued forming the letters, maintaining a steady rhythm until I reached the final syllable of my last name. Instead of allowing the ink to trail off in a continuous fluid loop, I abruptly broke the stroke, leaving a distinct, measurable gap before placing the final dot. To my arrogant family, the signature looked perfectly valid. To any certified federal forensic document examiner looking under high magnification, it was a screaming siren. It constituted undeniable legal proof that the document was executed under extreme coercion and physical threat. I signed the second page and then the third, meticulously applying the exact same flawed technique. I capped the silver pen and set it down on the glass surface. Julian did not even wait for me to step back. He snatched the paperwork right off the table. He inspected the ink, his eyes gleaming with unearned victory. He folded the documents, sliding them into the inner pocket of his custom suit jacket. He patted the fabric, securing his stolen lifeline. Beatrice let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief. She smoothed the front of her designer blouse, telling me I had finally acted like a proper daughter. She instructed me to fix my ruined makeup and prepare for the wedding rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. She offered a stern warning, demanding I not ruin the aesthetic of the upcoming event with a sour attitude. Madison glanced up from her smartphone screen long enough to issue a mocking smirk. She told me to smile because my sacrifice was funding the greatest day of her life. Richard simply pointed toward the door, commanding me to leave the premises before he changed his mind about destroying my career. I turned my back on them. I walked across the grand foyer without uttering a single word. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. Marcus was waiting near the edge of the circular driveway, leaning against the hood of his vehicle. His posture was rigid, his dark eyes scanning my face for any sign of injury the moment I emerged. He noticed the red mark blooming across my cheek where Beatrice had struck me, but he remained silent, knowing I had executed the strategy. I walked down the stone steps and stopped beside him. I looked back at the sprawling colonial estate, feeling nothing but cold detachment. I told Marcus that Julian took the bait. I explained that the groom had the signed guarantor forms in his pocket and was heading straight to his lending institution to secure the capital. Marcus let out a low, sharp breath. As a former federal investigator, he understood the exact legal threshold we had just crossed. He opened the passenger door for me, his expression shifting into a mask of predatory anticipation. By attempting to extort my signature, Julian had committed basic state-level blackmail. But the moment he walked into a federally insured bank and handed that specific piece of paper to a loan officer, his crime escalated exponentially. He was using fraudulent documents obtained through physical and psychological coercion to secure millions of dollars. He was initiating an interstate financial transaction built entirely on deception. The instant the bank teller scanned that specific duress signature, Julian officially committed federal bank fraud. He had single-handedly triggered a legal countdown that carried a mandatory maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He thought he had trapped me, but he had just locked his own prison cell from the inside. We climbed into Marcus' car, driving away from the toxic wasteland of my childhood home. The trap was armed, and the federal authorities already possessed the digital footprint of his previous bribery attempt. All we had to do was wait for him to finalize the loan. But a desperate man drowning in a $12 million deficit rarely moves in a straight line. As we merged onto the highway, my encrypted corporate phone buzzed with an urgent priority alert. My internal security team at Apex Global had intercepted a disturbing piece of intelligence regarding Julian's secondary financial maneuvers. He was not just waiting for the bank loan to clear. The approval process would take at least 48 hours, and his brokers were demanding immediate liquid collateral by tomorrow morning. To bridge the gap before the wedding, Julian had actively sought emergency cash from a highly dangerous source. He had just contacted an underground lending syndicate known for utilizing extreme violence to collect their debts. The notification on my screen confirmed the worst possible scenario. Julian had secured a $5 million shadow loan from a notorious loan shark, and he had used my sister Madison as the primary collateral. The rehearsal dinner took place 24 hours before the wedding ceremony at a 3-star Michelin restaurant located in the heart of the city. My parents had rented out the entire top floor to accommodate 50 elite guests. The room smelled of white truffles and expensive oak. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the space, casting a warm glow over the long banquet tables. Waiters moved silently across the plush carpet, refilling glasses with rare vintage wine. The atmosphere was designed to project an image of unshakable generational wealth and flawless family harmony. Madison sat at the center of the head table. She wore a custom gown encrusted with thousands of Swarovski crystals. The dress was heavy and ostentatious, catching the light with every slight movement she made. She looked like a human disco ball, desperate to absorb the attention of every person in the room. She leaned into Julian, laughing loudly at jokes made by the venture capitalists sitting nearby. She played the role of the radiant bride, holding court over her kingdom. I sat near the end of the long table, far away from the center of attention. I wore a simple black silk dress, sipping my sparkling water. Marcus sat to my right, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. We did not speak. We merely observed the performance unfolding before us. We were auditors watching a fraudulent ledger balance itself in real time. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal flute cut through the ambient chatter. Madison stood up, holding her champagne glass high. The room fell silent as the guests turned their attention toward her. She smiled, her eyes sweeping across the crowd before locking directly onto me. Her expression was a masterclass in manufactured sweetness, hiding a core of pure venom. "I want to raise a toast to my wonderful family," Madison announced, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "We have faced some stressful hurdles getting to this day. Building a future with a brilliant visionary like Julian requires sacrifice. It requires dedication." She paused, letting the spotlight focus entirely on her. She turned her body slightly, ensuring everyone followed her gaze down the length of the table toward my seat. "I especially want to thank my plain, boring older sister, Madison," continued, her smile sharpening into a cruel smirk. She finally stepped out of her dull cubicle life and sacrificed her little savings account to contribute to my husband's great empire. We all know she does not have much going on, so her modest financial donation to our wedding is truly appreciated. Let us toast to the people who stay in the background so the rest of us can shine. A ripple of low laughter echoed through the wealthy crowd. A few guests raised their glasses, offering me pitying glances. My father, Richard, nodded in approval, taking a long sip of his wine. Beatrice beamed at her golden child, thrilled by the public humiliation being inflicted upon me. They expected me to flush with embarrassment. They wanted me to drop my gaze or excuse myself from the table in tears. I did not blink. I picked up my steak knife and my silver fork. I smoothly cut a piece of my medium-rare filet mignon, slicing through the tender meat with surgical precision. I placed the food in my mouth, chewed slowly, and offered Madison a polite, serene smile. I raised my water glass in a silent toast. My total lack of an emotional reaction unsettled her. Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she sat back down, irritated that she had failed to draw blood. Marcus leaned close to me, his voice a low rumble beneath the returning chatter of the guests. He noted that the dress she is wearing costs more than the remaining balance in her bank account. He took a sip of his bourbon, his dark eyes scanning the head table. He told me to watch the groom. I shifted my focus to Julian. While Madison soaked in the lingering attention, Julian was physically unraveling. He sat rigidly in his chair, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking suffocating. He was not eating his food. He was staring down at his lap where his smartphone rested, hidden beneath the white linen tablecloth. The screen kept lighting up, casting a faint, erratic glow against his dark trousers. Julian picked up his water glass, but his hand trembled so severely the ice clinked against the rim. He set it down without taking a drink. He ran a finger under his collar, pulling at his silk tie. A visible sheen of cold sweat gathered at his temples. The arrogant hedge fund manager who had threatened to destroy my career yesterday was currently struggling to draw breath. Marcus tapped his own smartwatch, accessing the secure mirror feed he had established earlier in the week. The shadow loan Julian secured from the underground syndicate required pristine collateral. Those lenders operated outside the boundaries of civil law. They relied on swift, brutal enforcement. When Julian submitted my forged signature to the federal bank, the system flagged the anomaly. The resulting institutional delay caused a ripple effect in his credit profile. The loan sharks utilized their own illicit network to monitor his liquidity. They saw the bank hesitation. They realized the commercial real estate backing their $5 million loan was compromised. I watched the text message log update on Marcus' digital screen. The incoming communications to Julian phone were stark and lethal. The sender demanded their $5 million, returned in cash by midnight. The final message contained no financial jargon. It simply stated that failure to wire the funds tonight would result in a fatal accident for the bride before she ever reached the altar. Julian's face turned the color of ash. He dropped his phone onto his lap, running both hands over his face. He was trapped in an invisible vice. If he failed to pay the syndicate, they would execute their threat. If he went to the police, they would uncover his derivative fraud. He had exhausted his personal credit. He had drained his shell companies. He possessed only one remaining source of liquid capital. He pushed his chair back from the table, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. He abruptly stood up, ignoring the confused look Madison threw his way. He mumbled a weak excuse about a work emergency and turned his back on the dining room. He walked fast, his strides uneven, pushing past the waitstaff to reach the exit doors. "We stay here," I murmured to Marcus, cutting another piece of my steak. "Let him run." Julian practically sprinted through the opulent restaurant lobby, bursting out into the cool evening air. He did not wait for the valet. He jogged down the ramp, entering the underground parking garage where his luxury sports car was parked. The concrete walls of the garage amplified the sound of his ragged breathing. He unlocked his vehicle, climbing into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. The isolation of the car offered no comfort. He was a dead man if he did not produce $5 million in the next few hours. He opened the center console and pulled out a slim, encrypted laptop. He powered up the machine, connecting it to a portable cellular hotspot. His hands shook as he typed his biometric passwords into the login screen. He accessed the primary financial portal for my father import-export business. Richard had granted him administrative clearance to facilitate the money laundering scheme they had agreed upon earlier in the week. The corporate reserve fund sat right there on the screen, holding decades of accumulated family wealth. Julian hesitated for only a second. Survival instinct overrode whatever microscopic shred of loyalty he held for his future father-in-law. He initiated a high-priority wire transfer, bypassing the standard dual authorization protocols by exploiting the executive privileges Richard had foolishly handed him. He typed in the routing numbers provided by the loan shark syndicate. He entered the exact amount of $5 million, draining the reserve accounts dry. He clicked confirm. He let out a loud, gasping breath, resting his forehead against the steering wheel as the transaction processed. He believed he had just saved his own life. He thought he had outsmarted the criminal underworld by stealing from a legitimate business. Julian had no idea that his laptop was no longer a private device. When he logged into the corporate reserve system, he triggered the monitoring software deployed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every single keystroke, every secure login, every routing number was captured in real time. The federal agents sitting in their cyber command center watched the $5 million wire transfer execute. They tracked the money, leaving a legitimate domestic corporate account and dropping straight into a flagged illicit syndicate ledger. Julian had just provided the United States government with a pristine, irrefutable record of corporate embezzlement and criminal money laundering. He sat in his dark car, wiping the sweat from his face, convinced the worst was over. He checked his phone, waiting for the confirmation text from his dangerous creditors. The message arrived a few moments later, acknowledging the receipt of the funds. The threat to Madison was lifted. The immediate danger was neutralized. Julian smiled a weak, exhausted expression. He adjusted his tie, looking into the rearview mirror to fix his hair. He needed to return to the rehearsal dinner and play the role of the loving groom. He needed to maintain the illusion until the Apex Global merger finalized the following day. But as he reached for the door handle, a new notification popped up on his laptop screen. It was an encrypted email from the hacker he had hired on the dark web. The operative claimed they encountered a final firewall protocol, blocking their attempt to wipe the Apex Global server records. The hacker demanded Julian log into a specific terminal gateway using his personal credentials to authorize the final data scrub. Julian frowned, pulling his hands away from the door. He needed those derivative losses erased before my board reviewed his file. He clicked the link provided by the hacker, plunging headfirst into the digital snare I had waiting for him. The dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the skyline in sharp streaks of pale gold. Inside the bridal suite at the Waldorf Astoria, the air was thick with the scent of hairspray and manufactured panic. The morning of the wedding had arrived. For most families, this suite would serve as a sanctuary of joyful anticipation. For my family, it operated as a theater of profound toxicity. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up. The contrast between the pristine luxury of the hotel room and the ugly reality of the people occupying it was stark. Madison sat in the center of the room, surrounded by a frantic team of makeup artists. She sipped champagne, complaining about the lighting and demanding constant reassurance that she looked flawless. She believed today was her coronation. She had no idea her groom spent the previous night executing a federal crime to cover his margin call. Beatrice paced the length of the plush carpet, her heels sinking into the expensive fibers. She held a steaming cup of coffee, inspecting every detail of the bridal party preparation. Her eyes finally landed on me, and her manufactured smile vanished instantly. She stopped walking, her gaze raking over my attire with unfiltered disgust. I had refused to wear the mandated bridesmaid dress. Beatrice had selected a frilly pastel pink gown covered in cheap synthetic lace designed specifically to make anyone wearing it look foolish and subservient. It was a visual tactic to ensure Madison remained the undisputed center of attention. I chose a different aesthetic. I stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting the lapels of my outfit. I wore a custom-tailored white silk power suit. The fabric draped with mathematical precision, projecting sharp, unyielding authority. It featured a structured blazer and wide-leg trousers, paired with minimalist silver cufflinks. I looked like a woman preparing to walk into a high-stakes corporate boardroom, not a subordinate sister playing a background role. Beatrice marched across the room, setting her coffee cup down so hard the ceramic rattled against the glass table. She pointed a trembling finger at my reflection. "What are you doing, Chloe?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper to avoid alerting the hired stylists. "You are purposely trying to ruin your sister's special day. I sent you the pastel gown weeks ago. You look like a corporate director preparing to negotiate a hostile contract. Take that ridiculous suit off right now and put on the dress you were assigned." I did not flinch. I turned slowly, facing my mother. Her face was flushed, her jaw set in a rigid line of maternal authority. She was accustomed to bending everyone to her will, using shame as a weapon. "I am not wearing polyester," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "The suit stays." Madison caught our reflection in her vanity mirror. She spun around in her chair, nearly knocking a makeup brush out of the stylist's hand. She stared at my white silk suit, her eyes widening in sheer outrage. "You are wearing white to my wedding," Madison shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are doing this on purpose. You want people to look at you instead of me. You want to sabotage my aesthetic because you are a bitter, lonely spinster. Mom, make her change. She is humiliating this family." Beatrice stepped closer, attempting to use her physical presence to intimidate me. She lowered her voice, issuing a threat she believed held actual weight. "If you walk out of this suite wearing that suit, you will be cut out of the family business permanently," Beatrice warned. "Your father and I will ensure you inherit nothing. We will publicly distance ourselves from you. Do not test my patience, Chloe. Julian is marrying into this family today, bringing us an elite financial network. We will not let your petty jealousy jeopardize our social standing." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. She was threatening to withhold a fake inheritance built entirely on laundered money and fraudulent commercial real estate. She was protecting a groom who had just drained her corporate reserve fund dry less than 12 hours ago. The irony was a delicious bitter wine. I buttoned the final silver button on my silk blazer. "My aesthetic choices are the least of your impending problems, Mother," I stated softly. I suggest you save your breath for the reception. Before Beatrice could launch another tirade, the heavy double doors of the bridal suite opened. Marcus stepped into the room, bringing an immediate shift in the atmospheric pressure. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore a dark tailored suit, radiating the calm, lethal energy of a seasoned federal investigator. The bustling makeup artists instinctively stepped back, granting him a wide path. Beatrice turned her fury toward my brother-in-law. "You are not supposed to be in here, Marcus," she snapped. "This room is restricted to the bridal party. Get out before I call hotel security." Marcus ignored her completely. He walked straight toward me, his dark eyes locked onto mine. He carried no wedding gifts and offered no pleasantries. In his right hand, he held a thick black envelope. The heavy cardstock bore a distinct, unbroken wax seal stamped with the official insignia of the United States Department of Justice. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I recognized the seal immediately. It was the physical manifestation of the trap we had armed over the past 48 hours. Marcus stopped directly in front of me. He handed over the black envelope. He gave a single microscopic nod, confirming the execution of our strategy. "The federal judge signed the order," Marcus murmured. His voice pitched low enough that only I could hear. The digital breadcrumbs from last night were undeniable. The cyber breach on the Apex servers connected directly to his personal device, along with the illegal transfer of corporate funds. I took the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the paper. I traced my thumb over the government seal. I asked Marcus a single question regarding the timeline. "The global asset freeze?" Marcus replied, a predatory satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "It officially went into effect exactly 10 minutes ago. Every linked routing number, every shell corporation, every personal checking account, they are locked down tighter than a federal vault." I absorbed the information, letting the reality settle over me. Julian had logged into the hacker gateway last night, sealing his fate under cyber terrorism statutes. He had wired $5 million to a loan shark, draining my parents' business reserves. Now the federal government had stepped in, pulling the financial plug on their entire fraudulent ecosystem. The money was trapped. The credit lines were dead. They were walking into a lavish, multi-million-dollar wedding ceremony without a single cent to their names. Beatrice crossed her arms, glaring at Marcus and the black envelope. "I told you to leave," she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "What is that you are handing her? Stop whispering in the corner and get out of my suite." I slid the black envelope into the inner pocket of my white silk blazer. I looked at my mother, projecting an aura of pure ice. "Just reviewing a rather important contract," I replied smoothly. "You should go check on the groom, mother. I am sure he is eager to see you." Just as the words left my mouth, a sudden violent commotion erupted outside the bridal suite. The thick hotel walls could not muffle the sound of a man losing his mind in the corridor. It was a loud, guttural roar, followed by a string of aggressive profanities echoing down the quiet hallway. Madison jumped in her chair, clutching her silk robe. Beatrice frowned, stepping toward the door. The aggressive shouting grew louder, moving closer to our suite. I recognized the voice instantly. It was my father, Richard. He was not using his polished country club baritone. He sounded frantic, unhinged, and deeply humiliated. The heavy double doors burst open. Richard stumbled into the room, his face an unhealthy shade of purple. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo looking rumpled and tight. He gripped his smartphone in one hand and a sleek black metal credit card in the other. "Richard, what on earth is wrong with you?" Beatrice hissed, rushing toward him. "Keep your voice down. The wedding planner is right down the hall. You are making a spectacle." Richard did not look at his wife. He stared at the black credit card in his hand as if it had betrayed him. His chest heaved with rapid, erratic breaths. The card was declined. Richard gasped, the words tearing from his throat. The black card was declined at the valet stand. Beatrice stopped in her tracks, a look of profound confusion crossing her features. "What are you talking about?" she asked, dismissing the notion entirely. "That is the primary corporate account. It has no limit. The machine must be broken. Have the hotel staff run it again. They ran it 4 times. Richard yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The valet manager tried to run it. The concierge tried to run it. I had 50 guests arriving in exotic cars, expecting their parking to be validated by the host. The hotel staff told me the account is frozen. They told me to contact my banking institution immediately. The makeup artists in the room exchanged nervous glances, slowly backing away toward the vanity mirrors. Madison stood up, her face paling as the reality of a financial glitch threatened to cast a shadow over her perfect morning. It gets worse. Richard continued wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. I tried to pull cash from the secondary business line to pay the florist for the extra orchids you ordered. The bank automated system played a pre-recorded message stating the funds are inaccessible due to a federal compliance hold. I cannot access a single dollar. Beatrice shook her head, her pristine facade finally showing cracks of genuine terror. That is impossible. Call Julian. Tell Julian to use his hedge fund accounts to cover the incidentals until Monday morning. He has millions in liquid capital. He can fix this. I called Julian. Richard snapped, his eyes darting frantically around the room. It went straight to voicemail. I cannot find him anywhere. The groom is missing, and I am standing in the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, looking like a broke peasant trying to pay for parking. I stood silently near the window, watching the mighty patriarch crumble into a pathetic state of panic. He believed a frozen credit card was a temporary inconvenience. He thought a quick phone call on Monday would clear up the banking error. He had no concept of the avalanche hurtling toward him. He did not know that his corporate reserve fund was drained by the very man he wanted as a son-in-law. He did not know that the federal compliance hold was actually a global asset freeze initiated by the United States Department of Justice. He did not know that the man he was desperately trying to call was currently trapped in a digital snare, facing multiple counts of federal wire fraud and cyber espionage. The storm had officially made landfall. Marcus stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, watching the chaos unfold with clinical detachment. I adjusted my white silk blazer, feeling the weight of the black envelope secured in my pocket. My family was unraveling before the ceremony had even begun. They were stranded in a luxury hotel, surrounded by wealthy peers they could no longer afford to impress. I looked at my mother, who was frantically dialing Julian's number on her own phone. I looked at my sister, who was weeping over the prospect of unpaid floral arrangements. I looked at my father, staring blankly at a useless piece of black metal. They had spent my entire life tearing me down, treating my career as a joke and viewing my intellect as a threat. They had pushed me into a corner, demanding I fund their superficial existence while attempting to sell me out to a fraudster. They asked for a corporate director. Now they were going to get one. I walked slowly toward the door, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. I passed my hyperventilating father and my terrified mother. I will see you all at the altar, I stated, my voice cutting through their panic with icy precision. Do not be late. We have a very important contract to finalize today. I stepped out into the corridor, with Marcus following close behind, leaving them to choke on the fumes of their collapsing empire. The ceremony was waiting, and the execution was ready to commence. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria hummed with the quiet rustle of expensive silk and the clinking of crystal. 300 of New York's most influential financial players sat in gilded chairs. Hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and corporate board members waited for the ceremony to begin. The air smelled of imported white lilies and old money. A string quartet played a delicate classical piece, perfectly masking the rot underneath the floorboards. I stood in the front row, next to Marcus. My tailored white silk suit contrasted sharply with the sea of traditional dark tuxedos and pastel dresses around me. I kept my posture rigid, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. Marcus mirrored my stance, his dark eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of a veteran investigator. We were not wedding guests. We were the executioners waiting for the trap to snap shut. At the front of the room, Julian stood on a raised velvet platform. He adjusted his silk bow tie, rolling his shoulders back. He looked like a king preparing for his coronation. His bespoke suit draped flawlessly over his frame, hiding the desperate, frantic man who had wired $5 million stolen dollars to a loan shark just hours prior. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought the cyber attack had wiped his slate clean. He believed the impending $50 million merger with Apex Global would rescue his sinking fund and elevate him to the highest tier of Wall Street royalty. As he scanned the front row, his gaze met mine. He offered a quick, arrogant smirk. He thought my white suit was a pathetic cry for attention from a bitter sister. He had no idea I was merely wearing the uniform of a corporate titan preparing to oversee a liquidation. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. The string quartet shifted into the traditional bridal march. Madison stepped into the aisle, gripping my forearm. Her dress was an extravagant display of layered tulle and Swarovski crystals. She beamed at the audience, soaking in the adulation she craved her entire life. She walked slowly, demanding every eye remain fixed on her sparkling silhouette. Beside her, Richard marched with rigid determination. He held his chin high, projecting the image of a proud, wealthy patriarch. I studied his face, noticing the tight lines around his mouth and the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. The elite crowd saw a dignified father giving away his golden child. I saw a terrified man whose credit cards had just been declined at the valet stand. He was using this grand public spectacle as a shield, praying that a successful merger would magically erase his frozen accounts before Monday morning. He was walking his daughter down the aisle while his entire commercial real estate empire stood on the edge of a sheer cliff. Richard handed Madison over to Julian. The groom kissed her cheek, wrapping a possessive arm around her waist. They turned to face the officiant, a distinguished judge, hired specifically to add a layer of prestige to the event. The judge cleared his throat, opening his leather-bound book. He spoke about trust, mutual respect, and building a foundation on honesty. The irony tasted metallic in the back of my throat. I glanced at my smartwatch, counting the seconds. The digital markets wait for no one, and federal news embargoes lift at very precise moments. The officiant raised his hands to deliver the vows. Before he could utter the next sentence, a sharp electronic ping cut through the quiet ballroom. It was not a single isolated sound. A second ping echoed from the third row. Then a chime rang out from the left aisle. Within 3 seconds, a synchronized wave of alerts, buzzes, and notifications erupted across the entire venue. Financial executives live and die by their Bloomberg terminal updates and customized market alerts. When breaking news hits the sector, their phones deliver the message instantly. The polite decorum of the high society wedding dissolved. Men in expensive tuxedos reached into their breast pockets. Women opened their designer clutches to check their screens. The quiet reverence of the ceremony was replaced by a rising tide of alarmed whispers. Julian frowned, his irritation visible. He despised anything that stole the spotlight. But the buzzing did not stop. It multiplied. The murmur of the crowd grew into a harsh, undeniable noise. A venture capitalist sitting in the second row gasped aloud, showing his phone to the hedge fund manager next to him. Julian could no longer ignore the shifting atmosphere. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face. He reached into his own tailored pocket, pulling out his smartphone. He tapped the screen. I watched his eyes track the breaking news headline. The color drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out corpse. His jaw dropped. His chest stopped moving. The financial alert broadcasted to every major investor in the room was devastatingly clear. Apex Global Investments officially terminates $50 million merger with Julian Thorne, citing allegations of severe financial fraud and an active federal inquiry. The news alert detailed the discovery of manipulated derivative ledgers, a hidden $12 million margin call, and unauthorized capital transfers. The smartphone slipped from Julian's trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack. His knees buckled. He staggered backward, losing his footing on the velvet platform. He collided directly with the towering arch of white lilies. The heavy wooden structure groaned under his weight before tipping backward and crashing to the floor. White petals and shattered wood scattered across the altar. Madison shrieked, jumping out of the way, holding her crystal-covered dress. She stared at her groom, who was now sprawled amid the ruined floral arrangement, gasping for air. The ballroom descended into pure chaos. Guests stood up from their gilded chairs, pointing at the stage. The whispers mutated into loud accusations. Investors realized they were attending a celebration funded by a fraudster who was currently under federal investigation. Richard broke through the confusion. His patriarchal instincts drove him forward, but fear fueled his movements. He rushed the altar, stepping over the broken lilies, to reach Julian. "What is happening?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Get up. You are ruining the ceremony." Julian could not speak. He just pointed a shaking hand at the phone, lying face up on the marble floor. Richard knelt down, snatching the device. His eyes scanned the glaring headline. The patriarch read the words detailing the canceled merger and the federal probe. But the newsfeed auto-refreshed, pushing a secondary related headline to the top of the screen. Richard stopped breathing. The subsidiary article outlined the scope of the federal net. It explicitly stated that the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division had placed a specialized holding company under immediate surveillance. The holding company named in the federal alert was Richard's own import-export business. The very same business he had used to blind guarantee Julian debts. The very same business that housed his entire life savings. The reality of the frozen credit cards in the lobby suddenly made terrifying sense. Richard dropped the phone, his hands shaking as a cold sweat broke across his body. He turned his head, looking past the ruined altar and the weeping bride. His panicked gaze cut through the chaotic crowd, locking directly onto me. I stood in the front row, my white silk suit gleaming under the chandeliers. I did not break eye contact. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding train, but before he could even utter my name, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom were thrust open by a force that silenced the entire room. The chaotic noise of the ballroom suddenly felt very distant. The wealthy investors, politicians, and corporate elites were frozen in a state of suspended animation. Richard stood by the ruined floral arch, his face an unhealthy shade of gray. He was staring at me, waiting for a lifeline that would never arrive. I did not offer one. I took a deliberate step forward. The sharp click of my designer heels struck the imported marble floor. The sound cut through the suffocating tension like the steady strike of a judge gavel. Click, click, click. The crowd parted naturally, forming a wide path as I walked toward the raised platform. My white silk power suit gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, projecting an aura of untouchable authority. Madison was weeping near the altar, clutching her ruined designer gown. She looked like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been broken. Julian was still gasping for air on the floor, his tailored tuxedo covered in crushed white petals. He looked pathetic. I reached the steps of the platform and ascended with unhurried grace. I did not need a microphone. The room was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and retrieved a thick legal dossier. I held the heavy stack of documents high in the air, allowing the bright lights to catch the official government seals printed on the cover. Julian Thorne is not a financial prodigy. I announced, my voice echoing with clinical precision across the cavernous hall. He is not a visionary hedge fund manager. He is a desperate fraud. The words hit the audience like a physical shockwave. A few hedge fund managers in the front row exchanged horrified glances, realizing they had almost invested their own capital into his sinking ship. The groom standing before you today just embezzled $12 million. I continued maintaining unbroken eye contact with the crowd. He forged commercial mortgage signatures, using his future father-in-law real estate empire as blind collateral. And when he realized his audit was approaching, he hired a black hat operative on the dark web to destroy corporate evidence. The revelation of federal cybercrimes pushed Julian past the brink of sanity. The polished aristocratic facade he had meticulously curated for years disintegrated in a fraction of a second. He let out a raw, feral roar that sounded more animal than human. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He locked his gaze onto the legal dossier in my hand, believing that if he could just destroy the physical paper, he could somehow erase the reality of his crimes. He lunged across the platform, rushing toward me with reckless speed. He intended to tackle me to the ground and tear the documents to shreds. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I knew my perimeter was secure. Marcus had anticipated this exact reaction. My brother-in-law spent a decade executing high-risk raids for the Securities and Exchange Commission dealing with cornered white-collar criminals who suddenly realized their wealth could no longer protect them. Marcus moved with blinding fluid speed. He stepped between Julian and me, intercepting the charge effortlessly. He grabbed Julian's extended arm, twisting the wrist backward, while simultaneously sweeping his leg behind the groom knees. The tactical takedown was flawless and brutal. Julian crashed hard onto the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. Marcus dropped his weight, driving a knee firmly between Julian's shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the ground. He secured Julian's arm in a professional submission lock, neutralizing the threat instantly. Julian groaned, thrashing against the floorboards, but he could not break the iron grip of the former federal agent. Madison shrieked, dropping to her knees near the edge of the stage. She clawed at her expensive veil, sobbing hysterically as she watched her perfect wedding dissolve into a criminal crime scene. I ignored her theatrical cries. I walked over to where Julian lay pinned against the wood. I crouched down, bringing my face level with his sweating, terrified features. I reached into my pocket, one final time. My fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of metal. I pulled out the gold-plated tie clip. It was the exact same accessory Julian had carelessly dropped 2 days ago when he mocked my navy dress and boasted about his elite status. I tossed the gold clip onto the floor. It landed with a sharp, metallic clatter, stopping mere inches from his nose. Julian stared at the engraved metal, his breathing ragged and shallow. Recognition sparked in his wide eyes. "You dropped this at the engagement party," I whispered, my tone dropping to a lethal quiet register meant only for him. "Right before you met me in that dingy coffee shop and tried to bribe me with a Honeypot account." His eyes widened further, the puzzle pieces finally snapping together in his panicked mind. He realized the quiet sister he had continuously insulted was the very architect of his downfall. "You told me some people simply do not belong in high society," I said, letting a cold smile touch my lips. "You were right, Julian. Fraudsters belong in federal holding cells. And just for the record, I am the Senior Director of Risk and Compliance at Apex Global. It was my profound privilege to personally sign the order canceling your $50 million contract." Julian let out a choked, agonizing gasp. The realization that he had been begging his own executioner for a bribe shattered his remaining sanity. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his face against the floorboards as the inescapable weight of his failures crushed his lungs. He was bankrupt, exposed, and physically restrained in front of every single peer he had ever tried to impress. The elite guests in the ballroom began backing toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. No one in the financial sector wants to be photographed near a man wanted for federal bank fraud. Richard stood frozen near the altar, his chest heaving. His grand plan to use his daughter's marriage as a vehicle for his own corporate salvation had turned into a public autopsy of his business practices. He had willingly signed away his company as a shell node for a man who possessed nothing but debts and lies. He looked at his own hands, realizing he had signed his own financial death warrant just to secure a 10% stake in a non-existent empire. Beatrice, however, refused to accept defeat. My mother operated on pure delusion, believing her social standing could overwrite factual reality. She hiked up her designer gown and stormed toward the front of the room, her face contorted with misplaced rage. She pointed a trembling finger at me, demanding that the hotel management intervene immediately. She screamed for the security staff to physically remove me from the premises, claiming I was a deranged, jealous woman ruining a sacred family event. She turned to the crowd, pleading with them to ignore my lies. She told the guests that I was fabricating evidence because I could not handle seeing my sister find true happiness. She demanded that someone call the police to arrest Marcus for assault. She did not realize the hotel management was currently occupied. The venue staff was busy dealing with a much larger disruption gathering in the main lobby. The flashing red and blue lights illuminating the frosted glass windows of the grand entrance were not a coincidence. The sirens wailing outside the building were not for a medical emergency. They were the sound of an impending federal raid. Beatrice was screaming for security, while the ultimate security force was already marching down the hotel corridor, preparing to breach the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. Beatrice could not fathom the reality of her social demise. She watched the elite hedge fund managers and influential politicians inching toward the exit doors. Her pristine reputation, built over decades of calculated country club maneuvering, was turning to ash in front of her eyes. Her self-preservation instinct mutated into blind feral rage. She hiked up her heavy designer gown and charged toward the raised platform. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of hatred. She raised her right hand, aiming a sharp open palm strike directly at my cheek. She shrieked that I was destroying the family honor and demanded I shut my mouth. I did not flinch or retreat. I stood my ground, keeping my posture rigid. Marcus was occupied pinning Julian to the floorboards, leaving me to face her incoming assault. I prepared to catch her wrist midair. Before Beatrice could close the final 2 feet between us, a deafening crash reverberated through the cavernous hall. The heavy oak double doors at the main entrance did not simply open. They were kicked inward with a staggering force that sent the brass handles smashing into the interior drywall. The lingering murmurs of the wealthy guests died instantly. Beatrice froze, her raised hand hovering in the air, her wide eyes darting toward the back of the room. It was not the hotel security team arriving to restore order. A tactical unit poured into the ballroom. They wore dark windbreakers emblazoned with stark yellow letters spelling out Federal Bureau of Investigation across their backs. Flanking them was a specialized squad of federal agents dressed in crisp gray suits bearing the official insignia of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The visual impact of federal law enforcement cutting through a sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos was striking. The sheer, unyielding authority of their presence crushed the remaining arrogance in the room. The elite crowd naturally parted, forming a wide, clear path. Men who managed billion-dollar portfolios averted their gaze, terrified of making eye contact with the federal investigators. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern jawline, marched down the white aisle runner. His heavy tactical boots crushed the scattered white orchid petals into the marble floor. He bypassed my frozen mother and stepped directly onto the stage. Marcus gave a curt professional nod and smoothly released his submission hold on Julian. He stepped back, blending into the shadows of the altar. Julian gasped for air, scrambling onto his hands and knees. He tried to crawl backward away from the advancing authorities. His bespoke tuxedo was ruined, stained with sweat and crushed flowers. 2 tactical agents grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. He thrashed weakly, but the agents locked his arms in place with effortless strength. The lead agent stopped mere inches from Julian's face. He reached into his jacket and held up a gold federal badge, allowing the harsh stage lights to catch the metal. Julian Thorne, the agent, declared his voice, projecting a cold, resonant finality that reached the furthest corners of the silent ballroom. You are under arrest for securities fraud, bank fraud, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. Any statement you make will be documented and used against you in a federal court of law. The sharp metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing across the room sounded like the ceiling of a vault. The cold metal snapped tightly around Julian's wrists, binding his hands behind his back. The self-proclaimed Wolf of Wall Street shrank into a hollow, trembling shell. He wept openly, shedding genuine tears of terror. He pleaded with the agents, stammering incoherent excuses about misplaced funds and temporary liquidity issues. His sophisticated vocabulary vanished, leaving only the pathetic whimper of a thief caught red-handed. Richard could not remain a silent observer. His patriarchal ego demanded he assert his dominance even against the United States government. He puffed out his chest, smoothing the lapels of his tuxedo. He stepped into the aisle, blocking the path of the advancing financial investigators. He raised his chin, attempting to project the untouchable aura of a commercial real estate mogul. "You are making a terrible mistake," officers Richard boomed, trying to summon his usual booming baritone. "I demand to speak with your superior. I know the mayor and I sit on the board of 3 regional banks. My son-in-law is a respected hedge fund manager. This is a private family event, and you are trespassing on rented property." A female investigator stepped around the lead tactical agent. She wore a sharp gray blazer and held a thick legal binder clamped under her arm. Her expression held zero sympathy. She looked at Richard the way a scientist observes a doomed specimen under a microscope. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a lethal clinical precision that stripped away his defensive armor. "We do not answer to the mayor, Mr. Thorne," the investigator replied, maintaining unblinking eye contact. "And judging by the financial data we verified this morning, you no longer sit on any banking boards." She unclasped her binder and extracted a stack of documents bearing the official seal of a federal judge. "Because you knowingly signed cross-collateralization agreements, using your corporate assets to blind guarantee illicit offshore transactions, you are officially named as a co-conspirator in a federal money laundering network." She handed the documents directly to Richard. He took them with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the bold legal print. The agent continued delivering the fatal blow without a shred of hesitation. "A federal judge signed the global asset freeze order 20 minutes ago. The government has officially seized your commercial warehouses. Your import-export firm accounts are locked. The colonial estate in the suburbs is currently being boarded up by our field agents. Your luxury vehicles, your retirement portfolios, and your investment trusts are confiscated. You are destitute this very second." The color drained from Richard's face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The papers slipped from his trembling fingers, scattering across the marble floor. He clutched his chest, gasping for breath, as the reality of his total financial ruin crushed his lungs. Beatrice let out a piercing, high-pitched wail. She collapsed onto her knees, right there in the center of the aisle, ignoring her ruined designer dress. She covered her face, sobbing into her hands, mourning the loss of her wealth, her status, and her precious country club memberships. The mighty empire was reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. I stood on the platform watching the execution of justice with a steady, serene heartbeat. The ledger was finally balanced. The individuals who had treated my career as a joke and my intelligence as a liability were now facing decades in prison. But the destruction of their finances was only the opening act. Standing near the ruined floral arch, Madison watched her groom get dragged away in chains and her parents stripped of their entire fortune. She realized the luxurious future she envisioned was dead. Instead of weeping for her husband, she straightened her posture. Her survival instinct kicked into overdrive. She wiped the fake tears from her cheeks, turned her furious gaze toward Richard and Beatrice, and opened her mouth to deliver a betrayal that would shatter the final remaining pieces of our bloodline. Madison stared at the steel handcuffs binding her groom. She looked at the federal agents securing the perimeter. Her gaze shifted to her mother, sobbing on the floor, and her father trembling in shock. The luxurious future she had envisioned vanished into thin air. A life of endless credit cards, private jets, and country club memberships evaporated right before her eyes. Madison was a woman who survived entirely on the wealth of others. Recognizing that the sinking ship offered no survivors, her self-preservation instinct kicked into high gear. She did not kneel to comfort her weeping mother. She did not reach out to hold her arrested husband. Instead, Madison hiked up the heavy layers of her crystal-encrusted wedding dress and threw herself toward the lead federal investigator. She dropped to her knees on the scattered white petals, her designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne and dirt from the marble floor. She wrapped her hands desperately around the leg of the revenue agent. "I did not know anything," Madison shrieked, her voice echoing with a raw, piercing pitch that made the nearby guests flinch. "You have to believe me. I am a victim. They forced me to do it." The agent tried to step back, but Madison clung tighter, burying her face against his trousers. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at her parents. Richard and Beatrice stared at their golden child, their faces registering a new layer of profound horror. "They made me fake the pregnancy," Madison wailed, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. My dad knew his import business was failing. He told me I had to trap a rich hedge fund manager. When Julian started running out of money, my parents forced me to invent the rare medical complication. They orchestrated the entire Swiss clinic story to extort the $5 million from him. I never wanted to steal. I just wanted a beautiful wedding. They made me do it to save their bankrupt company. The high society guests murmured in revulsion. The elegant facade of the elite family was stripped away, revealing a nest of scavengers eager to cannibalize their own blood to avoid prison. Richard's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. He lunged forward, raising his hand to strike his daughter for her public betrayal. A tactical agent immediately stepped into his path, shoving Richard back with a firm hand against his chest. Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls. "You traitorous little brat!" she hissed, her aristocratic poise replaced by the snarl of a cornered animal. "We did everything for you. We sacrificed our reputation to buy you a crown, and you sell us out to save your own skin." The family tore each other apart in the center of the aisle, trading vicious insults and exposing decades of hidden resentment. Julian watched the spectacle from the floor. He knelt on the polished stone, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The self-proclaimed Wolf of Wall Street looked at the people he had fought so hard to impress. He realized he had not married into a dynasty. He had married into a syndicate of broke, desperate con artists. They had used him just as ruthlessly as he had tried to use them. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. He looked away from the screaming bride and the fighting parents. His bloodshot eyes slowly tracked upward, stopping when he saw me, standing on the raised platform. I remained an island of calm in a sea of destruction. My white silk suit reflected the chandelier light, untouched by the dirt and chaos spreading below. I held the legal dossier loosely by my side, watching his empire burn. Julian's mind raced, searching for any remaining lifeline. His firm was ruined. His reputation was dead. He was facing decades behind bars. But I was the senior director of risk and compliance at Apex Global. I represented a conglomerate with endless capital and legal resources. In his terrified, desperate brain, I was the only person possessing the power to halt the execution. "Chloe," he gasped, struggling against the grip of the tactical agents holding his arms. "Chloe, please listen to me." The agents jerked him upward, but Julian let his knees give out, intentionally dropping his weight to the floor. He crawled forward, dragging his expensive, ruined trousers across the marble. He stopped at the bottom step of the platform, looking up at me with a face soaked in tears and sweat. The arrogance that defined his entire existence was eradicated. He wept openly, shedding the pride he once wore, like a badge of honor. "I was wrong," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I was stupid. I got caught up in the margins and the greed. You know how the market operates. The pressure makes you do crazy things. Please, you have the power to stop this. Tell the federal agents it was a corporate misunderstanding. Tell them Apex Global intends to absorb the debt." I looked down at the man who had mocked my wardrobe and threatened my career just 2 days ago. I did not speak, allowing his desperation to echo in the cavernous hall. "Buy out my fund," Julian begged, tears streaming down his face. "If Apex acquires the portfolio, the liabilities become internal corporate restructuring. The investigators will drop the wire fraud charges if the parent company assumes the risk. Please, Chloe. I will sign whatever you want. I will hand over all my voting rights. I will work in a cubicle. I will be your slave for the rest of my life. Just do not let them put me in a cage. Buy the company." The venture capitalists standing near the front rows watched in silent fascination. They were witnessing a man beg for his freedom by offering to sell his soul. I let the silence stretch, ensuring every guest heard his pathetic surrender. I took a slow, measured step down the wooden stairs. My heels clicked softly as I closed the distance. I stopped on the final step, standing just inches above him. I looked into his terrified eyes, feeling a deep, resonant satisfaction. "You miscalculated the situation. Julian," I stated, my voice smooth and projecting clearly across the room. "You assume that Apex Global walked away from the acquisition because your books were dirty. You assume we canceled the merger." A flicker of desperate hope sparked in his bloodshot eyes. He leaned forward, his bound hands straining against the steel cuffs. "You did not cancel it," he whispered, his voice trembling with a fragile prayer. "You are still going to buy the fund?" I offered a slow, razor-sharp smile. "Corporate raiders do not walk away from distressed assets. Julian, we simply wait for the valuation to crash. When a firm is drowning in $12 million of hidden debt and its chief executive is indicted for federal bank fraud, the market value plummets rather quickly." I stepped off the platform, standing eye to eye with him as he knelt on the floor. Apex Global did not cancel the buyout. I announced, ensuring the federal agents and the corporate investors heard the precise legal reality. We simply renegotiated the terms based on the new risk profile. "We just officially acquired your bankrupt hedge fund, Julian. We own your client list, your proprietary algorithms, and your remaining clean capital." Julian let out a shaky breath, a relieved laugh bubbling in his throat. "You bought it. You saved me." I shook my head, the cold smile remaining fixed on my lips. "We did not buy it to save you. We bought it to liquidate it. And because your liabilities far exceeded your assets, the board of directors authorized a very specific purchase price." I reached into the pocket of my silk blazer. My fingers closed around a small round object. I pulled my hand out, holding the item pinched between my thumb and index finger. "We acquired your entire empire," I declared, my voice ringing with lethal finality. "For exactly $1. I flicked my wrist. A heavy silver $1 coin sailed through the air. It hit the imported marble floor with a sharp, metallic clink. The sound cut through the silence of the room. The coin bounced, rolling in a tight, dry circle. The silver disc spun rapidly, the metallic whirring noise echoing against the walls. Everyone watched the coin. It slowed, wobbling on its edge, before finally dropping flat. The coin came to a dead stop, resting right against the tip of Julian's ruined leather dress shoe. Julian stared at the silver dollar, the final piece of the puzzle locked into place within his mind. The conglomerate did not absorb his debt. They weaponized his bankruptcy. He no longer owned a company. He no longer possessed a title. He had nothing left to bargain with. I had just purchased his entire life work for the spare change found in a coffee shop tip jar. The microscopic spark of hope in his eyes extinguished instantly. His shoulders collapsed. He let out a low, agonizing wail that tore from the depths of his chest. It was the sound of a man recognizing his own total annihilation. He slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor right next to the silver coin. His tears pooled on the stone as he wept for the honor, the wealth, and the freedom he had traded away for absolute ruin. I stood over his broken form, looking at the silver coin resting near his shoe. The execution was flawless. The ledger was balanced. But the shockwave of this corporate slaughter was about to trigger a final desperate reaction from the people watching the collapse. As the federal agents hauled the weeping groom to his feet, preparing to march him out the doors, my mother, Beatrice, realized she was the only one left standing in the crosshairs. The federal agents hauled the weeping groom to his feet. Julian's expensive dress shoes scraped against the imported marble, leaving dark scuff marks next to the silver dollar that signaled his total ruin. He was no longer a person of interest or a hotshot financial manager. He was a secured asset belonging to the United States justice system. As the tactical officers marched him toward the heavy oak doors, the sheer gravity of the situation finally penetrated the dense denial clouding the rest of my family. The illusion of aristocratic grace shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Stripped of their commercial real estate portfolios, their hidden offshore accounts, and their unearned social superiority, they devolved into feral creatures trapped in a sinking cage. Panic breeds hostility, and there was no loyalty left among these thieves. Madison remained kneeling on the floor, her designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne and crushed orchid petals. She had just publicly confessed to participating in a medical extortion scheme to save her own skin, throwing our parents directly into the federal crosshairs. Richard stood a few feet away, staring at the daughter he had groomed to marry into wealth. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unvarnished fury. His import-export business was seized. His luxury vehicles were confiscated. His reputation among the Wall Street elite gathered in the room was reduced to a cautionary tale. He needed a target for his overwhelming humiliation. Richard crossed the distance in 2 rapid strides. He did not speak. He raised his hand and struck Madison across the face. The slap echoed through the cavernous ballroom, sharp and stinging. It was the sound of a patriarch realizing his dynasty was nothing but ash. Madison cried out, tumbling sideways into the ruined floral arrangements. She clutched her cheek, staring up at her father in terror. Her diamond tiara slipped from her carefully styled hair, clattering onto the stone tiles. The federal agents stationed near the altar reacted instantly. 2 tactical officers rushed forward, restraining Richard, locking his arms behind his back. He struggled against their grip, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He roared at Madison, calling her a traitorous brat who ruined his empire. He blamed her fake pregnancy for drawing the attention of the authorities, ignoring the fact that his own tax evasion and money laundering had laid the groundwork for his destruction. Beatrice watched her husband get subdued by law enforcement. Her country club poise dissolved into a hysterical breakdown. She realized that the elite guests, the venture capitalists, and the hedge fund managers were watching her family tear each other apart. The social exile was instantaneous. Her peers were already backing away, treating her like a contagion. Her gaze darted frantically around the room until it locked onto me. I stood on the raised platform, my white silk suit immaculate under the crystal chandeliers. I watched the chaos with the detached curiosity of an auditor reviewing a closed ledger. Beatrice channeled all her remaining despair into a targeted strike against her eldest daughter. She shoved past a hotel coordinator, her heels clicking erratically as she marched toward the stage. "You did this!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. Her face was streaked with running mascara. "You cold-blooded monster! We gave you life. We raised you in a home full of privilege, and you stab your own creators in the back. You orchestrated this entire nightmare just to punish us. You could not stand seeing your sister happy. You destroyed your own family because you are an unnatural, heartless machine." She stood at the bottom of the steps, trembling with rage, waiting for me to engage in a screaming match. She wanted me to defend myself to show a flicker of guilt or remorse. She wanted to drag me down into the mud with her to make me look just as unhinged as she did. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, measured step down the wooden stairs, closing the distance until I stood eye to eye with the woman who had spent 3 decades making me feel inadequate. I looked into her desperate, weeping eyes and felt a profound sense of liberation. The emotional chains she had used to control me were gone. "You told me my navy dress embarrassed this family at the engagement party," I said, my voice steady and sharp as a scalpel. "You dragged me into a corner and called me cheap. You said I humiliated you in front of the elite." Beatrice opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer coldness of my tone silenced her. "Now you can see clearly, Mother," I continued, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "The only thing embarrassing this family is your filthy greed. You forged medical records. You stole from your own business. You enabled a fraudster just to buy your way into a higher tax bracket. You built a kingdom out of trash. I am just the one taking out the garbage." The words struck her with physical force. Beatrice staggered backward, her hands flying to her chest. She gasped for air, unable to formulate a single cohesive thought. The stark reality of her reflection terrified her. She was not a victim of a jealous daughter. She was the architect of a criminal syndicate that had just been dismantled. The lead investigator from the Internal Revenue Service stepped forward, signaling the end of the conversation. She carried the heavy binder containing the asset seizure warrants. She informed Richard and Beatrice that they were being detained for questioning regarding their role in the cross-collateralization fraud. The tactical agents moved in surrounding my parents. The spectacle of their removal was methodical. The agents did not grant them the dignity of a quiet exit. Richard was marched down the white aisle runner, his hands bound behind his back. The wealthy guests who had once attended his lavish dinner parties now turned their backs whispering to one another, documenting his downfall on their smartphones. Madison was hauled to her feet by a female officer sobbing uncontrollably as she trailed behind her father. Her heavy, crystal-encrusted train dragged across the floor, collecting the debris of her shattered fairy tale. Beatrice walked in a state of catatonic shock. Her eyes were blank, her posture slumped. The imposing matriarch who had dictated the rules of high society was reduced to a shuffling prisoner. They were paraded through the grand doors of the ballroom, escorted out of the luxury they had tried to steal. I followed at a calculated distance, walking alongside Marcus. We moved through the opulent hotel lobby. The contrast between my unhurried, confident stride and my family's frantic disgrace was poetic. The hotel staff watched in stunned silence as the federal convoy approached the revolving glass doors. But the true reckoning awaited them on the sidewalk. Apex Capital had already released the press statement regarding the canceled merger and the discovery of severe financial irregularities. In the financial sector, news travels at the speed of light. When federal agents raid a high-profile wedding at the Waldorf Astoria, the press does not wait for an invitation. The moment the heavy glass doors opened, a blinding storm of camera flashes erupted. Dozens of financial reporters, photographers, and news crews swarmed the barricades set up by local police. Microphones were thrust into the air. Reporters shouted questions about the missing $12 million, the offshore shell companies, and the sudden collapse of the Thorne hedge fund. The cold evening air bit through my silk suit, but I barely felt it. I watched Julian flinch, covering his face with his bound hands as the camera flashes illuminated his tears. Richard tried to hide his face behind the collar of his ruined tuxedo, but the photographers captured every angle of his disgrace. Madison wept loudly, shielding her face with her bouquet, but the lenses caught the mud-stained hem of her designer gown. Beatrice stared straight ahead, blinded by the lights, her social empire officially reduced to front-page tabloid fodder. They were shoved into the back of waiting black federal vehicles. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them in darkness. The sirens wailed, bouncing off the concrete canyons of the city as the convoy pulled away from the curb. The wedding of the century had transformed into the most explosive financial scandal on the East Coast. The reporters began to disperse, rushing to file their breaking stories. The hotel staff started clearing the barricades, restoring order to the pristine sidewalk. I stood near the entrance, breathing in the crisp city air. The oppressive fog that had clouded my entire life was gone. The ledger was clear. The debts were paid. Marcus turned to me, pulling his phone from his pocket. "The agents are securing the evidence boxes at the import-export warehouse," he reported, his voice carrying a note of deep, professional satisfaction. "The digital freeze is holding firm across all their accounts. The operation is a success." I nodded, watching the taillights of the federal convoy disappear into the Manhattan traffic. It was a flawless execution, but the work was not entirely finished. A corporate takeover requires integration. I turned back towards the glowing lobby of the hotel, preparing to return to my penthouse and finalize the absorption of Julian ruined company. The execution was over, but the empire building was just beginning. 6 months later, the dust settling over the New York financial district brought a profound sense of clarity. I sat in the center of my new residence, a sprawling penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The property was worth tens of millions of dollars, purchased through an anonymous trust. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city I now essentially governed. The ambient noise of the traffic far below was sealed away behind thick, soundproof glass, leaving the room in a state of pristine tranquility. I held a crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux, letting the rich, dark wine breathe before taking a slow, measured sip. Sitting across from me on the custom leather sofa were the only two people who had earned my unwavering loyalty. Marcus rested his arm along the back of the couch, projecting the calm strength of a man who had helped orchestrate a flawless federal takedown. Beside him sat my older sister, Maya. She had distanced herself from our parents' toxic orbit years ago, and watching her smile freely in my home solidified the peace I had fought so hard to secure. We did not need to speak loudly to acknowledge the magnitude of our victory. The empty silence in my previous life used to be filled with anxiety and manipulation. Today, the silence felt like power. The federal justice system moves with a deliberate, unyielding rhythm. Once the initial shock of the wedding raid faded, the reality of the indictments set in. The prosecuting attorneys, armed with the meticulous forensic dossier I provided, did not even entertain the idea of a plea deal. They brought the full weight of the United States government down upon the people who thought their wealth rendered them invisible. Julian Thorne stood before a federal judge, stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant smirk. During the sentencing hearing, he looked hollowed out. His defense attorneys attempted to argue that he was under immense psychological stress due to the volatile market. The judge remained entirely unmoved by his pathetic excuses. The evidence of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and dark web cyber espionage was airtight. Julian received a sentence of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Under federal sentencing guidelines, there is no opportunity for early parole. He will spend the next 2 decades locked inside a concrete cell, wearing a standard-issue uniform far away from the corner offices he once thought he commanded. The crowning stroke of his ruin was the finalization of the corporate buyout. Apex Global officially absorbed his bankrupt hedge fund. The $1 coin I threw at his feet became the legally binding purchase price. We stripped his remaining clean assets, acquired his proprietary trading algorithms, and liquidated his staff. His entire professional legacy was erased from Wall Street history in a single afternoon. My parents faced a similarly devastating reckoning. Richard and Beatrice had spent their entire adult lives building a kingdom on a fault line of fraud. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation utilized the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act to dismantle their operation. Because they had willingly signed cross-collateralization agreements using stolen funds, they were convicted as active co-conspirators in a massive money laundering network. The judge handed them each a 15-year federal prison sentence. The asset forfeiture wiped their existence clean. The government seized their commercial import-export warehouses, their luxury vehicles, and their hidden offshore accounts. But the most poetic justice was the fate of the sprawling Hamptons estate, the very same manicured property where my mother had cornered me and mocked my tailored silk dress was put up for public auction. It was purchased by a rival real estate developer whom my father had despised for decades. Beatrice suffered a psychological collapse when she realized her social standing was permanently dead. The elite country club friends she had catered to instantly erased her from their memories. The women who used to sip champagne at her charity galas now actively pretended she never existed. My mother is currently serving her sentence in a federal correctional institution. The woman who obsessed over designer labels and flawless aesthetics is now forced to wear identical khaki scrubs and follow the strict barking orders of prison guards. Her unearned superiority was systematically broken down by the harsh, uncompromising reality of federal incarceration. Madison experienced perhaps the most agonizing descent of all. When Julian was hauled away in handcuffs and our parents were stripped of their wealth, she was left with nothing but the soiled wedding dress on her back. She had spent her life cultivating an influencer persona, funded entirely by stolen credit lines. Without my father bankrolling her vanity projects, and without a wealthy groom to finance her future, she was thrown into the unforgiving reality of the working class. The banks repossessed her leased sports car. The landlords evicted her from her luxury downtown loft. With no college degree, no marketable skills, and a highly publicized scandal attached to her name, no corporate entity would hire her. Today, the bride who wore Swarovski crystals works the night shift as a cashier at a dusty highway gas station on the outskirts of the state. Marcus had received a routine update from a private investigator detailing her new life. The contrast was staggering. Madison spends her nights standing under flickering fluorescent lights, wearing a scratchy polyester uniform that smells of cheap coffee and engine oil. She rings up stale pastries and packs of cigarettes for tired truck drivers. Her current reality is a constant stream of humiliation. She frequently endures harsh reprimands from a regional manager who does not care about her former zip code or her perceived status. When she makes a mistake on the cash register, she is forced to lower her head and apologize. The arrogant sister who stood at the head of a Michelin star banquet table and mocked my financial prudence now counts loose change to afford her monthly rent in a cramped studio apartment. I set my wine glass down on the marble coffee table. Resting next to my glass was a heavy linen envelope bearing the official seal of the Apex Capital Board of Directors. I had received the document earlier that morning. It was a formal letter of appointment. Following my flawless execution of the hostile takeover and my unprecedented ability to mitigate severe corporate risk, the executive board voted unanimously on my promotion. I was officially named the Global Vice President of Apex Capital. I now controlled the financial trajectory of multiple international sectors, wielding a level of influence that dwarfed the combined ambitions of everyone who had ever tried to hold me back. Maya reached across the table and tapped the linen envelope. She offered a warm, proud smile, acknowledging the grueling journey I had navigated. She noted that I had not just survived the storm, but I had learned how to control the lightning. Marcus raised his glass in a silent toast, his analytical mind fully appreciating the flawless execution of the legal trap. We sat together enjoying the serene environment built on a foundation of genuine loyalty and mutual respect. Society perpetually conditions women to act as the emotional shock absorbers for their families. We are taught from a young age to forgive unspeakable betrayals, to swallow our pride, and to sacrifice our own boundaries just to keep the peace at the holiday dinner table. The world demands that we shrink our ambition and silence our intuition to protect the fragile egos of the people around us. But I had proven a definitive, undeniable truth. The boundary of blood is not a magical shield that excuses toxic abuse. Sharing a genetic lineage does not grant someone a free pass to exploit your intellect, steal your resources, or mock your independence. When you recognize that a relationship is rooted in parasitism, the most empowering decision you can make is to sever the host. I did not defeat my family by screaming in their faces or throwing emotional tantrums. I did not waste my energy begging them to see my worth or demanding apologies they were incapable of giving. I retreated into the shadows. I gathered data. I mapped their vulnerabilities with surgical precision, and I waited for their own boundless greed to blind them to the danger. When you stand at the pinnacle of your own power, and you learn to wield the law as a sharpened sword, you realize that loud reactions are for the weak. The ultimate vengeance is achieved through unwavering focus and terrifying calmness. Let them mistake your silence for submission. Let them build their fraudulent castles higher and higher. Because when you finally pull the structural pin, holding their lies together, the resulting collapse will be inescapable. My stillness was not a surrender. It was the most devastating, unstoppable revenge they never saw coming. Looking down at the glittering expanse of Manhattan from my penthouse window, I reflect on the incredible distance between my past and my present. The journey from standing in a dim Hamptons alcove wearing a navy silk dress while my mother ridiculed my existence to sitting in this boardroom as the global vice president of Apex Capital was paved with deliberate choices. I did not just survive a targeted attack from the people who were supposed to protect me. I dismantled their entire fraudulent ecosystem. From the ashes of their greed, I built a fortress of peace. As I close this chapter of my life, I want to share 3 critical lessons I extracted from the ruins of my former family. First, biological ties do not obligate you to endure psychological abuse. Society constantly conditions women to absorb toxic behavior from relatives under the guise of family loyalty. We are told to swallow our pride and forgive the unforgivable to maintain a polite facade. I learned that true loyalty requires mutual respect and integrity. Walking away from a poisonous family dynamic is not an act of betrayal. It is the ultimate declaration of self-worth. You owe nothing to individuals who view your intellect as a threat and your assets as a resource to be plundered. Protect your perimeter ruthlessly. Second, authentic power resides in stillness. When the groom and my parents attempted to corner me in that living room, they relied on physical intimidation and theatrical rage. They wanted me to break down, weep, or engage in a pointless screaming match. They failed to understand that emotional reactions surrender your tactical leverage to the enemy. By maintaining a calm, detached demeanor, I force them to operate blindly. Silence terrifies people who thrive on chaotic manipulation. When you refuse to participate in their emotional theater, you seize control of the entire board. Let your enemies shout their threats while you quietly engineer their inescapable downfall. Third, logic and legal boundaries represent the most lethal weapons you can wield against arrogant predators. My family operated on pure delusion, believing their fragile social status insulated them from real-world consequences. I operated on data risk, compliance, and strict federal regulations. A custom tuxedo and a country club membership offer zero protection against a federal asset freeze. I did not need to seek illegal retribution or lower myself to their level of petty deceit. I simply utilized the unyielding framework of the law to let their own boundless greed consume them. Keep your hands immaculate and let the justice system serve the execution. The hollow empire they tried to build on lies is gone, replaced by a legacy of accountability. My life today is defined by authentic connections, profound freedom, and the quiet hum of true authority. Thank you for listening to my journey of dismantling a fraudulent dynasty and reclaiming my future. If you found satisfaction in watching unearned arrogance meet its inevitable ruin, hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories. Stay sharp, protect your boundaries, and always remember that the most devastating retaliation is delivered in perfect silence.